Hey guys, tonight we begin an extraordinary journey into one of history's most controversial love stories. Picture this: a penniless American girl from Baltimore, born into scandal, twice divorced, allegedly trained in exotic Chinese massage parlours, somehow nearly became Queen of England. How? How does a woman with absolutely nothing, no royal blood, no fortune, no pristine reputation, how does she captivate a king so completely that he throws away the most powerful throne on earth? Tonight, we're peeling back the layers of Wallis Simpson's early life, and trust me, the truth is far stranger than any fairy tale. Now, before we dive deep into Wallis's world, I'd love it if you could take just a second to subscribe and hit that like button, but only if tonight's story truly speaks to you. I genuinely want to know, where are you watching from right now? Your bedroom? A late night drive? Drop a comment and tell me what time it is where you are. And hey, if you're enjoying this, share it with someone who loves a good historical mystery. Alright, dim those lights, maybe turn on a fan for that gentle white noise, get comfortable. Because we're about to step back to June 19th, 1896, to a small mountain resort town where a baby girl entered the world under a cloud of shame. Blue Ridge Summit, Pennsylvania, 10:30 at night. In a modest wooden cottage called Squaw Cottage at the Monterey Inn, a young woman named Alice Montague is in labour. Outside, the summer air is thick and humid. Inside, there's tension you could cut with a knife. Because this birth, it shouldn't be happening at all. You see, Alice's family and her husband's family, they were both horrified when these two fell in love. Alice came from the genteel but broke Virginia Montagues. Her husband, Teakle Wallis Warfield, came from the newly wealthy Warfields of Maryland. Sounds promising, right? Except for one tiny detail. Teakle was dying of tuberculosis, had been sick since childhood. Both families begged them not to marry. He'll be dead within a year, they said. You'll be a widow with nothing. But Alice was already pregnant, and in 1895, that meant scandal with a capital S. So they eloped. Got married secretly on November 19th, 1895, in a pastor's living room. No church, no family, just shame and whispered gossip. And now, 7 months later, little Bessie Wallis Warfield enters the world. They named her after Alice's favourite aunt, Bessie Merriman, but she'd always go by her middle name, Wallis, same as her father's middle name. Here's the heartbreaking part. Baby Wallis would never know her father. 4 months later, just 4 months, Teakle Wallis Warfield was dead. Tuberculosis took him, just like everyone predicted. Alice was now a 24-year-old widow with an infant, no money, and 2 families who'd said, "I told you so." Think about that for a moment. Wallis's entire life began with loss. No father, a mother dependent on charity, the whispers in Baltimore society. That's the Warfield baby, the one whose parents had to get married. Such a shame. Alice had no choice but to move back to Baltimore and throw herself on the mercy of the Warfield family. Specifically, Teakle's mother, Anna Emery Warfield, and his brother, the formidable Solomon Davies Warfield, Uncle Sol, as he'd become known. Now, Uncle Sol was a piece of work. He was president of the Continental Trust Company, ran several railroads, and was richer than God. But he was also cold, calculating, and deeply resentful of his brother's foolish marriage. Still, he couldn't let his niece starve, so he paid for young Wallis's education, but always as a grudging favour, never as a loving uncle. Wallis grew up in the Warfield mansion on Preston Street, but she was never quite family, more like a charity case they couldn't get rid of. And Wallis knew it. Even as a little girl, she could feel it. The way Uncle Sol would look at her mother with contempt. the way he'd mention the cost of things, the way every dress, every meal, every piano lesson came with an invisible price tag of obligation and shame. But here's what's fascinating. Instead of breaking her, this childhood of dependence forged something steel-hard inside Wallis Simpson. She learned early that she couldn't rely on family money or social position. She had to rely on herself, her wit, her style, her ability to charm and dazzle. Uncle Saul eventually paid for her to attend Oldfield School, the most expensive girls' school in Maryland. And let me tell you, Wallis made every penny count. She wasn't the prettiest girl there, she wasn't the richest, but she was always, always the best dressed. Even with limited means, she had this uncanny ability to make an outfit look expensive, to carry herself like she belonged in any room. Her classmates remembered her for being impeccably groomed, sharply intelligent, and devastatingly witty. She graduated at the top of her class, but more importantly, she graduated with something money can't buy: social survival skills. She knew how to read a room, how to make powerful people like her, how to never ever appear desperate even when she was. Because deep down, Wallis understood something most people never learn. In a world that judges women by their marriages, she needed to marry well. Not for love, though the would be nice, but for survival. And so, in 1916, opportunity knocked. Wallis was 20 years old, visiting relatives in Pensacola, Florida, when she met him. Lieutenant Earl Winfield Spencer Jr. Win to his friends, a U.S. Navy pilot. Tall, dashing in his uniform, pioneer of American naval aviation. He was charming, exciting, and came from a wealthy Chicago family. Win Spencer was everything young Wallis thought she wanted. After a whirlwind 6-month courtship, they married on November 8, 1916. Wallis must have thought her prayers were answered. Finally, security, status, a handsome officer husband. The Warfields couldn't look down on her anymore. Except there was one tiny problem Win forgot to mention during their courtship. He was an alcoholic. Not just a social drinker, a violent, abusive drunk. The fairy tale shattered almost immediately. The couple moved to the Pensacola Naval Base, and Wallis found herself trapped in what she called rented bungalows and tasteless government housing. Every time a plane went down, a deafening crash gong would sound across the base. Wallis would hold her breath, waiting to see if it was Win. Once it was. His aircraft dove straight into the bay. He survived, thank God, but the experience left her terrified of flying for life. But worse than the fear was the drinking. Win would come home drunk and cruel. Wallis would later tell friends about being locked in bathrooms, about the verbal abuse, about the night she'd lie awake wondering if this was all her life would ever be. They separated briefly in 1921. She tried to make it work again in 1923. But Win was posted from base to base, San Diego, Boston, Washington, D.C., and everywhere they went the same nightmare followed. A military wife's life on a shoestring budget, with a husband who drank away his demons and took his failures out on her. By 1924, Wallis was done. But here's the problem. Her Uncle Sol absolutely forbade her from divorcing. In the 1920s, divorce was scandalous. It marked you, ruined you socially. Uncle Sol made it clear, if she divorced Win, she'd be cut off completely. No more money, no more support. So Wallis found herself in an impossible position. She couldn't stay with Win. He was destroying her. But she couldn't leave him without losing everything. And that's when she made a decision that would define the rest of her life. She'd rather be broken free than wealthy and trapped. In 1924, Win was posted to China. And in a move that shocked Baltimore society, Wallis decided to join him, not to reconcile, but to buy herself time. Time to figure out her next move. Time to experience something beyond the suffocating confines of Navy bases and Baltimore parlors. What happened next is shrouded in mystery, rumor, and a whole lot of speculation. Biographers call it her Lotus Year. Those months Wallis spent travelling alone through China during the era of warlords and opium dens. And folks, the rumours about this period are absolutely wild. According to some accounts, Wallis didn't just tour China, she transformed there. She allegedly spent time in Shanghai, Beijing and other cities, moving through circles of diplomats, adventurers and expatriates. Some biographers claim she worked in or frequented massage parlours where she learned, let's call them exotic techniques, that would later captivate the Prince of Wales. Now, I'm not going to get too graphic here, this is a bedtime story after all, but the implication was that Wallis acquired sexual knowledge that was unusual for Western women of her era. Whether that's true or just salacious gossip, we'll never know for certain. What we do know is that multiple intelligence agencies, British MI5 and the FBI, later investigated these rumours, worried she might have been a spy. But here's what we know for sure happened. Wallis had an affair with Count Galeazzo Ciano, a handsome Italian fascist who would later become Mussolini's son-in-law and foreign minister. The affair was passionate, intense, and according to multiple sources resulted in a pregnancy. And then came the tragedy that would haunt Wallis forever, a botched abortion. This wasn't like today, with medical care and safety standards. This was a back-alley procedure in 1920s China, and it went horribly wrong. The abortion left Wallis unable to ever have children. At 28 years old, her body had been permanently damaged. Think about what that meant for a woman whose only path to security was marriage. In the 1920s, a woman's value was often measured by her ability to provide an heir. And Wallis, whether through terrible luck or terrible choices, had lost that ability. Some biographers argue this is why she never had children with Edward. Others claim it's why she was so desperate to marry well. She knew she'd never have a family to fall back on. She'd always be alone unless she secured her position through marriage. Wallis finally returned to America in 1927, and this time, Uncle Sol or no Uncle Sol, she filed for divorce from Win Spencer. The divorce was finalised on December 10th, 1927. She was 31 years old, twice divorced, well, once, but with a spectacularly failed first marriage, unable to have children, and essentially penniless. By every measure of her society, Wallis Warfield Spencer was a failure. Damaged goods. A cautionary tale other mothers would tell their daughters. Don't end up like that Simpson girl. But here's the thing about Wallis. She refused to be broken. Even before her divorce was final, she'd already met her next husband, Ernest Aldrich Simpson. He was a British-American shipping executive, Harvard-educated, cultured, stable. He ran his family's successful global shipping firm, Simpson, Spence and Young, founded by his father in 1880. Ernest was also married, but unhappily so. When he met Wallis, he saw a sophisticated, witty, beautifully dressed woman who could hold her own in any conversation. He saw someone who'd survived hardship with grace. And Wallis? She saw safety, security, a ticket to London high society. Ernest divorced his first wife, Dorothea, and on July 21st, 1928, he married Wallis. She became Mrs. Ernest Simpson and moved to London, into a large, staffed flat in the fashionable Mayfair district. For the first time in her life, Wallis had what she'd always wanted: financial security, social status, and a stable marriage. Ernest doted on her. She decorated their home with impeccable taste, influenced by design legends like Ciri Morgan and Elsie de Wolfe. She hosted dinner parties that became the talk of London. She wore clothes like armour and wielded her sharp wit like a sword. Wallis Simpson had clawed her way from Baltimore charity case to London society hostess. She'd survived an abusive marriage, a mysterious year in China, a botched abortion, and the scandal of divorce. She'd rebuilt herself from nothing, and she was 35 years old when she walked into a party on January 10th, 1931, and met a man who would change everything. His name was Edward, Prince of Wales, future King of England, and he was about to become utterly, completely, devastatingly obsessed with her. Wallis would later say she had a cold that night. She wasn't at her best. But something happened in that first conversation. Maybe it was her American directness, so refreshing compared to the bowing and scraping Edward got from everyone else. Maybe it was her wit. Maybe it was simply timing. But for the first time in years, Wallis Simpson felt something she hadn't felt since she was that little girl in Baltimore, dependent on Uncle Sol's charity. The dangerous thrill of possibility. She didn't know it yet, but that conversation would lead to the greatest constitutional crisis in British history. It would make her the most talked about woman in the world. It would give her everything she thought she wanted, and take away things she didn't know she needed. But that night she was just Mrs. Simpson, respectable, married, safe. And she met a prince who'd been waiting his whole life for someone to see him as just a man. In our next part, we're going to dive deep into that prince's world, because to understand why Edward threw away a throne, you need to understand that he never wanted it in the first place. We'll explore his suffocating childhood, his reputation as the Peter Pan prince, his pattern with older married women, and the German connections that would later come back to haunt them both. The pieces are all on the board now. A damaged American woman who's learned to survive by her wits. A damaged British prince who's learned to hate his destiny. When these two collide, kingdoms will tremble. Stay with me. This story is just getting started. So we've met Wallis, the survivor, the social climber, the woman who rebuilt herself from ruins. But to understand why a king would give up everything for her, we need to understand the man himself. Because here's the thing nobody tells you about Edward of Faith. He was perhaps the most reluctant royal in British history. This wasn't a man who dreamed of wearing the crown. This was a man who spent his entire life trying to escape it. Let me take you back to June 23rd, 1894, Richmond, Surrey, England. White Lodge in Richmond Park. Queen Victoria, yes, that Queen Victoria, is still on the throne, and she's about to meet her great-grandson for the first time. The baby boy is named Edward Albert Christian George Andrew Patrick David. 7 names. Can you imagine? But his family would call him David. Just David. And maybe that tells you everything you need to know about this child's identity crisis from day one. Publicly, he was Edward, future king. Privately, he was just David, a little boy who wanted to be left alone. His father was the Duke of York, who would later become King George III. His mother was Princess Mary of Teck, later Queen Mary. And folks, if you're picturing warm, loving parents, picture again. George III was stern, cold, and absolutely terrified of showing affection. He believed in discipline, duty, and the stiff upper lip. Queen Mary was elegant, proper, and emotionally distant. Neither of them had any idea how to actually parent children. Young David grew up in a world of nannies, tutors, and rigid schedules. There are heartbreaking accounts from palace staff about how the children's nanny would actually pinch David and his younger brother Albert before bringing them to see their parents, just to make them cry. Why? So the parents would send them away quickly and she could maintain control. Think about that for a second. The woman trusted to care for the future King of England was literally abusing him to keep him dependent on her. And when this was finally discovered and she was fired, the damage was already done. David had learned early, The people who were supposed to love you would hurt you. The people who were supposed to protect you had their own agendas. Is it any wonder he grew up emotionally stunted? Now, when David was just 16 years old, everything changed. His grandfather, Edward VII, died in May 1910, and suddenly his father became King George V, which meant that David, this shy, sensitive teenager, became Prince of Wales, heir to the British Empire, next in line to rule over 1/4 of the world's population. And he hated it, absolutely hated it. They sent him to Naval College, tried to toughen him up. But David wasn't built for military discipline and rigid hierarchies. He was slight, boyish, and had this quality that people described as almost feminine. Not in a derogatory way, but in the sense that he was emotionally expressive in a way that made the old guard uncomfortable. When World War I broke out in August 1914, David begged to be sent to the front lines. He wanted to fight. He wanted to prove himself. But the government refused. The heir to the throne couldn't risk death in combat, so instead, he was made a staff officer, shuffling papers while his generation died in trenches. And here's what really messed him up. David would visit those trenches. He'd see the mud, the blood, the young men his age being torn apart by artillery. He'd see the senseless waste of it all. And then he'd go back to some chateau, put on his dress uniform and attend a formal dinner where everyone pretended everything was fine. It broke something in him. He'd later write that the war made him question everything. Duty, honour, the whole royal system. What was it all for? All this ceremony, all this tradition, while millions died because old men in palaces had decided young men should fight. And here's the kicker. He was good at one thing. Really good. When the war ended and they sent him on goodwill tours across the British Empire, Canada, Australia, India, South Africa, he was brilliant, charming, approachable, genuinely interested in people. He wasn't like his stiff father. He'd shake hands with miners, visit factories, talk to regular folks. The newspapers called him the most eligible bachelor in the world. Women swooned. He represented a new, modern monarchy. But David felt like a performing monkey, a product being sold to the masses. He'd smile for the cameras and die a little inside with each handshake. Now let's talk about his love life, because this is where patterns start to emerge. Patterns that explain everything that happened with Wallis. David didn't fall for debutantes or princesses or appropriate young ladies. No, no, no. David fell for older, married women. Specifically, married women who treated him badly. His first serious relationship, Frida Dudley Ward. She was married, 5 years older than him, and when they met in 1918, she basically told him to go away. She wasn't interested, and that made him obsessed with her. For 16 years, David pursued Frida, called her multiple times a day, wrote her letters constantly. She was his emotional anchor, and she liked the attention but kept him at arm's length. See the pattern? Unavailable woman. Rejection that felt like a challenge. Obsessive devotion. Then came Lady Thelma Finesse. Also married. Also older. Also someone who could control him. When Frida finally tired of David and moved on, Thelma swept in, and David transferred all that obsessive energy to her, showered her with gifts, rearranged his schedule around her, became absolutely dependent on her approval. Psychologists today would have a field day with this man. He was clearly seeking the maternal affection he never got from Queen Mary. But he was also seeking women who would dominate him, control him, make decisions for him, because that's what he had experienced his whole life, being controlled, being told what to do, never having agency. And here's what's really fascinating. His German relatives noticed this. Oh yes, let's talk about the German connection, because this becomes crucial later. You have to remember, the British royal family was deeply, deeply German. Their family name was Saxe-Coburg-Gotha, until they changed it to Windsor during World War I because, well, having a German name while fighting Germany was awkward. But the blood ties remained strong. David had cousins throughout German nobility. He'd spent summers in Germany as a child. He spoke German fluently, and unlike his father, who'd been horrified by German militarism during WWI, David retained a certain, shall we say, sympathy for German culture. In the 1920s and early 1930s, as Adolf Hitler rose to power, David started saying things that made British diplomats very, very nervous. In July 1933, and this is documented in the diaries of Robert van Sittart, a British diplomat, David attended a party where people were discussing Hitler's rise, and David said, and I quote, "It's no business of ours to interfere in Germany's internal affairs either regarding the Jews or anyone else, and dictators are very popular these days, and we might want one in England." Read that again. The future King of England said maybe Britain needed a dictator like Hitler. Now, was this just a young man being provocative? Was it genuine fascist sympathy? Or was it David's lifelong pattern of saying outrageous things because he enjoyed shocking the stuffy establishment? We don't know. But British intelligence started paying attention. They noticed David's friendships with pro-German aristocrats. They noticed his admiration for what he called Germany's economic miracle, Hitler's reduction of unemployment through massive public works and rearmament. David saw order, efficiency, national pride. He didn't see, or chose not to see, the persecution, the book burnings, the early signs of genocide. And folks, this matters. Because when David met Wallis, she was already moving in circles that included Nazi sympathizers. She lived in the same building as Princess Stephanie von Hohenlohe, a Nazi spy being monitored by MI5. Her social circle included people who viewed Hitler as a bulwark against Soviet communism, so when David and Wallis came together, they reinforced each other's worst instincts. She saw a man who could give her everything. He saw a woman who didn't judge him, didn't try to make him into something he wasn't. And together, they drift toward a political ideology that would nearly destroy them both. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you about May 1928, because this is when David's father, King George V, fell seriously ill. For a while it looked like the old king might die, and David, ready or not, would become king. And David had a panic attack, an actual panic attack at the thought of becoming king. His private secretary found him pacing, chain-smoking, talking about running away. "I'm not ready," David kept saying. "I don't want this. I never wanted this." Imagine being the heir to the greatest empire on earth and dreading it like a prison sentence. George V recovered, thank God. Well, thank God for David anyway, and David got a reprieve. But the incident revealed something crucial. David didn't just dislike being Prince of Wales. He was genuinely terrified of being king. The responsibility, the isolation, the weight of history, it was too much. And here's what makes this so tragic. David was actually good at certain aspects of royal life. When he could be himself, charming, informal, modern, people loved him. But the moment he had to be formal, traditional, royal, he crumbled. He wanted to modernize the monarchy, make it relevant, but his father and the old guard wouldn't let him. So David retreated. He spent more time at Fort Belvedere, his country house. He threw parties. He drank. He carried on affairs with married women. He ignored state papers and showed up late to official functions. He was essentially going through a decades-long rebellion against his destiny. His father despaired. "After I'm dead," George V famously said, "the boy will ruin himself within 12 months. Prophetic words. George V would die in January 1936. 12 months later, almost to the day, David would give up the throne. But before that happened, before the abdication crisis that would shock the world, David needed to meet the one woman who would finally give him permission to do what he'd always wanted: escape. By 1930, David was 36 years old, still unmarried, still bouncing between unsuitable women, still drinking too much and taking his royal duties less and less seriously. The British establishment was getting worried. The empire needed heirs. The Prince of Wales needed to settle down, marry someone appropriate, preferably a princess, and start producing future monarchs. But David kept choosing wrong, kept falling for exactly the kind of women he shouldn't fall for. And then, in January 1931, at a party at Borough Court, Lady Thelma Furness introduced him to her American friend, Mrs. Ernest Simpson, Wallis. Now, David would later claim he didn't remember much about that first meeting, said Wallis had a cold, wasn't at her best. But something happened. Some spark, some recognition. Maybe David saw in Wallis the same thing she'd developed over her hard life: survival instincts, the ability to charm while keeping your true self hidden, the performance of confidence masking deep insecurity. Maybe Wallis saw in David the same thing he'd been running from all his life: a man who needed someone to make decisions for him, to take control, to be the strong one. Or maybe, just maybe, they saw in each other a way out. Wallis saw security, status, jewels, power. David saw freedom from duty, someone who'd give him permission to walk away from the throne he never wanted. Have you ever met someone and just known that they were going to change your life, that nothing would ever be the same? Drop a comment if you felt that. Because I think that's what happened that night in 1931. For 3 years they circled each other, friends, part of the same social set. David would come to dinner at the Simpsons' flat. Ernest was apparently thrilled to host the Prince of Wales. But in 1934, Lady Thelma made a mistake. She went to visit relatives in New York for several weeks, and she asked Wallis, her friend, to take care of David while she was gone. Famous last words. Because when Thelma returned, David had completely cut her off. Wouldn't take her calls, wouldn't see her. He was done with Thelma Furness. He'd found someone new to obsess over, someone who would eventually cost him everything. In our next part, we're diving deep into the affair itself. How did Wallis go from dinner guest to royal mistress? What was it about her, specifically, that captivated David so completely? We'll explore the Mediterranean cruises, the jewellery worth millions, the moment Ernest Simpson realised he'd lost his wife to the future king, and we'll uncover the secret that British intelligence discovered, a secret that made them believe Wallis Simpson might be the most dangerous woman in England. Because here's what nobody expected. Wallis didn't want to marry the king. She liked being the mistress. She liked the jewels and the yachts and the attention. But when David decided he wanted her as his wife, when he decided he'd rather give up the throne than give her up, Wallis Simpson tried to stop him, tried to talk him out of it. But by then it was too late. The machine was already in motion, and neither of them could stop what was coming. Stay with me. We're about to witness how a love affair becomes a constitutional crisis. Here's the moment everything changed. January 10th, 1931. Borough Court, England. A dinner party that would alter the course of British history. And the crazy thing, neither of them saw it coming. Wallis was 34 years old, married to Ernest, finally stable for the first time in her life. David was 36, still the world's most eligible bachelor, still trapped in a life he didn't choose. When Lady Thelma Furness introduced them that night, there was no lightning bolt, no orchestral crescendo, just small talk between a prince and an American nobody. But here's what makes this fascinating. Wallis didn't throw herself at him. She didn't bat her eyelashes or giggle or act impressed. In fact, when David tried to make polite conversation, asking if she missed central heating now that she lived in England, Wallis shot back with typical American bluntness. "I'm sorry, sir, but you've disappointed me." Can you imagine telling the Prince of Wales he disappointed you within 5 minutes of meeting him? David was stunned. "How so?" he asked. "Every American woman who comes to your country is always asked that same question. I had hoped for something more original from the Prince of Wales." The room went silent. You could hear a pin drop. Everyone thought Wallis had just committed social suicide. But David? David laughed. Actually laughed. Because for once, maybe for the first time in his entire life, someone wasn't treating him like a prince. They were treating him like a regular person, a person who could be boring, a person who could be called out. And in that moment, something clicked. For the next 3 years, David and Wallis moved in the same social circles. He'd come to dinner at the Simpsons' flat on Bryanston Square. Ernest was absolutely delighted. Imagine being able to tell people, "The Prince of Wales dines at our home." Wallis would cook American dishes that reminded David of his travels. She'd tease him gently. She'd offer opinions on everything from politics to fashion, never holding back. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, David started depending on those evenings, started looking forward to them, started calling ahead to make sure Wallis would be there. Ernest Simpson, to his credit, seemed genuinely oblivious. Or maybe he was playing the long game, figuring that hosting the Prince of Wales would lead to business opportunities, maybe even a knighthood. Social climbing worked both ways after all. But Wallis? Wallis was walking a tightrope. She enjoyed the attention, sure, the glamour of it, the way heads turned when she walked into a room on the prince's arm. But she wasn't stupid. She knew how these things ended. Royal mistresses were a dime a dozen. Used up, cast aside, forgotten. She'd watched it happen to Frida Dudley Ward, to Lady Furness. So Wallis played it cool, kept Ernest happy, accepted David's invitations but always maintained plausible deniability. They were just friends, just part of the same social set. Until the summer of 1934, when everything changed. Lady Thelma Furness made what might be the worst decision of her life. She decided to visit her family in New York for several weeks, and before she left she pulled Wallis aside. "Darling," she said, "would you look after the prince while I'm gone? Keep him entertained?" Now, there are different theories about what Thelma meant by this. Some biographers think she genuinely trusted Wallis as a friend. Others think she was testing Wallis, seeing if she'd make a move. Still others think Thelma was already losing interest in David and wanted an excuse to exit gracefully. Whatever the reason, Thelma left for America, and Wallis found herself alone with the Prince of Wales more and more frequently. They started meeting for lunch, then tea, then dinner without Ernest present. David would drive out to Fort Belvedere, his private country house, and Wallis would join him. They'd walk the gardens. They'd talk for hours, and somewhere in those conversations something shifted. David started sharing things he'd never told anyone, his fears about becoming king, his resentment toward his parents, his feeling of being trapped. And Wallis listened, really listened. She didn't judge. She didn't offer platitudes. She just let him be vulnerable. Have you ever had someone in your life who just got you? Who didn't need you to be anyone other than who you were? That's what David found in Wallis. And for a man who'd spent his entire life performing, pretending, being what everyone else needed him to be, that was intoxicating. When Thelma returned from America in March 1934, she immediately sensed something was wrong. She invited David to lunch, expecting their usual warm reunion. Instead, David was cold, distant. He barely spoke to her. Later, Thelma confronted Wallis. "What happened while I was away?" Wallis, with that sharp wit of hers, allegedly said, "Darling, you should never have left him alone with me." And just like that, Lady Thelma Finesse was out. David cut her off completely, stopped taking her calls, returned her letters unopened. It was brutal. But it was also classic David. When he transferred his obsession to a new woman, the old one ceased to exist. Now David's full, overwhelming attention was focused on Wallis Simpson. Let me paint you a picture of what this looked like. Because the affair that developed wasn't subtle, it wasn't discreet, it was loud, expensive, and absolutely scandalous, if you were reading about it in American or European newspapers anyway. British papers stayed silent. There was a gentleman's agreement between the royal family and Fleet Street. We don't report on royal indiscretions. You don't make us look bad. But American papers, French papers, they had no such loyalty. By early 1934, headlines in America were screaming, "Prince of Wales in love with married American." Photos of David and Wallis on yacht cruises, at parties, at restaurants, always together, often without Ernest. And the gifts. Oh my God, the gifts. David started showering Wallis with jewellery like his life depended on it. And we're not talking about modest tokens. We're talking about a diamond and emerald engagement ring from Cartier, engraved with "We are ours now 27x36, October 27th, 1936, the day Wallis's divorce from Ernest became official. A flamingo brooch made of rubies, sapphires and diamonds, crafted during wartime when precious metals were scarce, meaning Wallis had to provide her own materials. Where did she get rubies during a war? Questions nobody wanted to answer. A Cartier bracelet with 9 crosses, each representing a significant moment in their relationship. A massive aquamarine and diamond clip from Cartier, which Wallis wore constantly. Prince of Wales feather brooches, charm bracelets with inscriptions, pearl necklaces. The list goes on and on. Biographers have estimated that David spent the equivalent of over $10 million in today's money on jewellery for Wallis in just 3 years. $10 million on a woman who was married to someone else. Where was he getting this money? Well, as Prince of Wales, he had income from the Duchy of Cornwall, basically a huge real estate portfolio that funded the heir to the throne. He was taking money meant for official duties and spending it on his mistress. The British establishment was horrified, but David didn't care. For him, jewellery was a language. Each piece said, "You belong to me." Each gift was a chain binding Wallis to him. And Wallis? She loved it. She'd grown up with nothing, remember? Lived off charity. Married one violent drunk and one kind but dull businessman. Now suddenly she had more jewellery than most queens. She wore it proudly, flaunted it. But here's the thing nobody talks about. Those jewels came with strings attached. Every emerald was a claim. Every diamond was a debt. Wallis was being bought, piece by piece, and she didn't realise it until it was too late. The summer of 1934 was when Ernest Simpson finally understood what was happening. David invited Wallis on a Mediterranean cruise aboard Lord Moyne's yacht, the Rosora. And for the first time, Ernest wasn't invited. It was just Wallis, David, and a small group of David's friends. They cruised from France to Spain to Corsica, swimming in crystal blue waters, dining on deck under the stars. Photographers tracked them everywhere. There's a famous photo from this trip. Wallis in a swimsuit laughing, with David gazing at her like she was the only person in the world. The intimacy is unmistakable. This wasn't a prince and a friend. This was a man utterly besotted. When Wallis returned to London, Ernest sat her down. "What are we doing here, Wallis?" And Wallis, God bless her honesty, said something like, "I don't know what you mean." But she did know. Everyone knew. Ernest was losing his wife to the future King of England, and there wasn't a damn thing he could do about it. Some accounts suggest Ernest made his peace with it. Maybe he figured being the ex-husband of the king's mistress had its own cachet. Maybe he was just tired of fighting. Or maybe, and this is what I suspect, Ernest Simpson was a decent man who loved his wife and realised he couldn't compete with a prince who could give her the world. By 1935, Wallis was barely pretending anymore. She was accompanying David to official functions. He took her to meet his parents, King George V and Queen Mary, at Buckingham Palace. Can you imagine how that went? The old king, stern and traditional, meeting his son's married American mistress. Queen Mary refused to even look at Wallis, just completely ignored her. Called her that woman behind her back, never used her name. To the royal family, Wallis Simpson was a problem that would hopefully go away once David got bored, like he'd gotten bored with all the others. But David didn't get bored. He got more obsessed. And this is where things get dark. Because British intelligence was watching all of this, and they were seeing things that terrified them. Remember, Wallis lived in Bryanston Court, and in the same building lived Princess Stephanie von Hohenlohe, a Hungarian-born Nazi spy who MI5 had been monitoring since 1928. MI5 had tapped her phones. They were reading her mail. They knew she was reporting to Nazi intelligence, and they watched as Wallis and Princess Stephanie became close friends. Tea together, shopping trips, long conversations. MI5 started following Wallis too, and what they discovered made them panic. Wallis was having an affair, but not just any affair, an affair with Joachim von Ribbentrop, the German ambassador to Britain, the man who would later become Hitler's foreign minister. Now let's be clear, Wallis's affair with Ribbentrop has never been 100% proven, but the circumstantial evidence is damning. There are FBI reports from informants stating that Ribbentrop would send Wallis 17 red roses at Princess Stephanie's flat, each rose representing a time they'd slept together. 17 times. British intelligence also had evidence that Wallis was present at dinners where sensitive government information was discussed. David, as Prince of Wales, received confidential briefings, and there were concerns, serious concerns, that David might be sharing state secrets with Wallis, who might be passing them to Ribbentrop, who would send them straight to Berlin. Was Wallis a spy? Probably not in any formal sense. But was she reckless, indiscreet, and willing to trade information for social access? Almost certainly. And was David too infatuated to care? Absolutely. By late 1935, David was in full self-destruction mode. He started missing official engagements. He'd show up late to state functions, clearly hungover. He stopped reading government briefings. His private secretary would beg him to focus, and David would wave him off. "I'm busy." Busy with Wallis. King George V was dying. Everyone knew it. His health was failing rapidly, and everyone also knew that when he died, David would become king. And if David was still obsessed with Wallis Simpson, married, American, possibly compromised by Nazi intelligence, Britain would face a constitutional crisis. In his final months, King George V said to his private secretary, "After I am dead, the boy will ruin himself within 12 months. George V died on January 20th, 1936. David became King Edward VIII, and the clock started ticking. Now here's what nobody expected. Wallis didn't want David to become king. She liked things exactly as they were. She was the prince's mistress, powerful without responsibility. She had the jewellery, the yachts, the attention, but she was still married to Ernest, still had her safety net. Becoming involved with a king? That was different. That was dangerous. Kings couldn't have married mistresses. Kings needed queens. And Wallis knew, she absolutely knew, that Britain would never accept an American divorcee as queen. But David had other ideas, because for the first time in his life, he saw an escape route. If he married Wallis, someone completely unsuitable, the establishment would have to let him abdicate. He could walk away from the crown he never wanted, and he'd have the perfect excuse: love. It was brilliant, tragic, and utterly selfish. Because David wasn't sacrificing the throne for Wallis. He was using Wallis to escape the throne, and Wallis was slowly realizing she'd become trapped in something far bigger than a love affair. In the next part, we're going deep into 1936, the year everything exploded. King George IV barely cold in his grave, and David's already making radical changes, slashing royal budgets, ignoring tradition, bringing Wallis to official functions, and in October 1936, Wallis files for divorce from Ernest. The die is cast. Britain is hurtling toward a constitutional crisis. Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin is having emergency meetings, the Church of England is preparing for battle, and Wallis Simpson is about to become the most hated woman in the British Empire. Because here's the thing, when David finally told Baldwin he wanted to marry Wallis, Baldwin said 4 words that would change everything. The people won't stand for it. And he was right. But David didn't care. Or maybe he cared too much about the wrong thing. Stay with me. We're about to witness how a love affair becomes a constitutional crisis that brings an empire to its knees. Picture a king who's been on the throne for exactly 11 months. He's made enemies of his staff, ignored his advisors, and spent more time on the phone with his mistress than reading government papers. Now picture that same king appearing at his own mother's birthday celebration with that mistress on his arm, while she's still married to another man. That's not fiction. That's November 1936, and that's exactly what Edward VIII did. But let me rewind, because 1936 was a year that moved like a slow-motion car crash. You could see the disaster coming, but nobody could stop it. When King George V died on January 20th, 1936, the entire nation went into mourning. Flags at half-mast, black armbands everywhere. The old king had ruled for 26 years through World War I, through the Great Depression. He was stability personified, and now he was gone. David, now King Edward V, stood at his father's deathbed and reportedly said, "I hope I will make good as he has made good." But even as he said it, sources claim his hands were shaking, not from grief, from fear. His first act as king was telling his private secretary to place a phone call, not to the Prime Minister, not to the Archbishop of Canterbury, to Wallis Simpson. He needed to hear her voice, needed her to tell him everything would be okay. Think about that. The King of England, ruler of the British Empire and its 486 million subjects, and his first priority is calling his married mistress. The palace staff were horrified. But what could they do? He was the king now. Edward threw himself into kingship with an energy that surprised everyone, but not in the way they hoped. Instead of learning protocol and building relationships with Parliament, Edward decided to revolutionize everything immediately. He ordered massive budget cuts to the royal household, fired long-serving staff without notice, change centuries-old traditions on a whim. He'd walk through Windsor Castle at night, turning off lights to save electricity. The press called it modernization. The staff called it chaos. But here's what really made the establishment nervous. Edward brought Wallis to everything: state dinners, official receptions, and most shockingly, to Balmoral Castle in Scotland, the private royal retreat, in August 1936. No mistress had ever been invited to Balmoral. It was family only, sacred ground. But Edward insisted, and Wallis came. She stayed in the king's quarters. They didn't even pretend to hide it. Queen Mary, Edward's mother, refused to visit while that woman was there. Edward's brother and sister-in-law, the Duke and Duchess of York, the future King George VI and Queen Elizabeth, were forced to entertain Wallis and act like everything was normal. Elizabeth, in particular, hated every second of it. She'd later tell friends that Wallis was rude, domineering, and had Edward completely under her thumb. And you know what? She was right, because by this point Wallis was making every decision. What Edward wore, who he met with, what events he attended. Edward would literally ask Wallis's permission before doing anything. His staff nicknamed her the Duchess, with heavy sarcasm. She acted like royalty without any of the actual responsibility. Now, while all this was happening publicly in Britain, there was another story unfolding in secret. The story British newspapers couldn't print but everyone in government knew about. MI5's surveillance of Wallis had intensified. They had agents following her movements. They were tapping her phone lines, and what they heard made them sick with worry. Wallis was still in contact with Joachim von Ribbentrop, still attending parties where Nazi sympathizers gathered, still passing along tidbits of information, nothing classified technically, but enough to paint a picture for German intelligence. There's a chilling FBI report from this period, declassified decades later, that states, "It has been ascertained that for some time the British government has known that the Duchess of Windsor was exceedingly pro-German in her sympathies and connections, and there is strong reason to believe that this is the reason why she was considered so obnoxious to the British government." Read that again. The FBI, America's FBI, believed Britain opposed Edward's relationship not just because Wallis was divorced, but because she was a potential security threat. Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin was getting pressure from all sides. The intelligence services warning him about Wallis, the Church of England preparing for battle over divorce, the Commonwealth nations, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, sending cables expressing their grave concern. But Baldwin was stuck. Edward was the king. You couldn't just tell a king what to do. The Constitution didn't work that way. So Baldwin did what British politicians do best. He waited. Hoped the problem would solve itself. Hoped Edward would get bored with Wallis like he'd gotten bored with all the others. Except Edward wasn't getting bored. He was planning. October 27th, 1936. Ipswich Assizes Court. A routine divorce hearing that would change history. Wallis Simpson versus Ernest Aldrich Simpson. Grounds. Adultery. Ernest didn't contest it. In fact, Ernest made it easy. There's evidence he staged his own affair to give Wallis grounds for divorce. He was seen at a hotel with another woman, conveniently caught by investigators. A gentleman to the end. The divorce was granted. Preliminary decree. It would become final in 6 months, May 1937. And that's when Prime Minister Baldwin realised, oh God, he's actually going to try to marry her, because Edward could have kept Wallis as his mistress indefinitely. Royal mistresses were nothing new, but marriage would make Wallis Queen Consort. She'd be crowned alongside him. Her face would be on stamps, on currency. She'd represent Britain to the world, a twice-divorced American, possibly a Nazi sympathizer, as Queen of England, Baldwin called an emergency meeting with the Archbishop of Canterbury, Cosmo Lang. The Church's position was crystal clear. They could not, would not, marry a divorced person whose previous spouse was still alive. Edward, as king, was supreme governor of the Church of England. He literally couldn't marry someone the Church forbade him to marry. It was a constitutional impossibility. But when Baldwin tried to explain this to Edward, the king just smiled and said, "Then I'll change the law." Baldwin stared at him. "Your Majesty, you can't change 1200 years of church doctrine. Watch me. Here's where things get really interesting." Because Edward wasn't actually in love with Wallis the way everyone thought. Or rather, he was in love with what she represented. Escape. There are letters from this period, private correspondence that's been analysed by historians, where Edward talks about abdication like it's an adventure. Like he's planning a vacation, not abandoning the throne. He wrote to Wallis, "Sooner or later, my pretty one, we're going to have to make a stand, and it's going to be a difficult one, but I'm ready whenever you are." Notice the language, make a stand, like he was a revolutionary, not a king shirking his duty. Edward had reframed the whole situation in his mind. He wasn't abandoning his responsibility. He was fighting for love against a cruel establishment. It's actually kind of brilliant in a twisted way. Because how do you argue against love? How do you tell someone their feelings are wrong? But Wallis was starting to panic. She'd signed up to be a royal mistress. Jewellery, yachts, attention. That was the deal. But Queen? That came with scrutiny she couldn't handle. It came with responsibility she didn't want. And most importantly, it came with hatred. Because by late 1936, Wallis Simpson was receiving death threats. Piles of them. Letters calling her a prostitute, a harlot, a homewrecker, threatening to kill her, threatening to disfigure her with acid. The British public, who'd been kept in the dark by press censorship, were finally learning about Edward's affair through foreign newspapers. And they were furious. Some of the letters were heartbreaking. Working-class women writing, "You're stealing our king. Don't you have any shame?" Wallis tried to talk Edward out of it. Multiple sources confirm she told him, "David, don't do this. Don't give up the throne. I'm not worth it." And Edward's response? "You're the only thing that is worth it." Which sounds romantic until you realise what he's actually saying. The throne means so little to me that I'd rather have you than it. That's not love. That's using someone as an excuse. By November 1936, the crisis reached a boiling point. British newspapers couldn't stay silent anymore. The foreign press was screaming the story. American tourists were bringing newspapers into Britain with headlines like, "Kingsmole renoed in Wolsey's hometown," referring to Wallis's divorce in Ipswich. On November 3rd, the Bishop of Bradford gave a sermon that broke the dam. He said, carefully choosing his words, "The king needs God's grace. We hope he is aware of his need. Some of us wish that he gave more positive signs of his awareness." It was coded language. But everyone knew what he meant. The king is living in sin with a married woman. The British press finally had permission to report, and they went wild. Headlines exploded. King and Mrs. Simpson, the crisis explained. Constitutional emergency. What will the king do? Parliament was in chaos. The Dominions were threatening to break away if Edward married Wallis. Baldwin was having emergency cabinet meetings twice a day. And Edward? Edward proposed what he thought was a brilliant compromise, a morganatic marriage. In a morganatic marriage, Wallis would become his wife but wouldn't become queen. She'd have no royal title, no official status. Any children wouldn't be in line for the throne. He could have his wife. Britain could avoid the scandal of Queen Wallis. Everyone wins. except Baldwin took the proposal to the cabinet and the Dominions, and the answer came back unanimous. No, absolutely not. Not in any form. Canada's Prime Minister Mackenzie King said it plainly. The people of Canada will not accept this woman in any capacity associated with the Crown. Australia agreed. New Zealand agreed. South Africa agreed. Even the British Parliament said no. Edward's response? Then I'll abdicate. And finally, people realised he wasn't bluffing. He'd actually been planning this all along. The morganatic marriage was never the goal. Abdication was. He wanted out, and Wallis was his ticket. December was a nightmare. Edward barely pretended to do his job. He spent all day on the phone with Wallis, who'd fled to France to escape the press. She was staying at a villa in Cannes, terrified, reading hate mail, begging Edward to reconsider. "You're destroying yourself," she told him. "You're destroying the monarchy. Please, David, please don't do this." But Edward had made up his mind. On December 5th, he told Baldwin formally, "I have decided to abdicate." Baldwin, who'd spent months trying to prevent this, just nodded wearily. "Very well, Your Majesty. I'll prepare the necessary documents." Can you imagine being Baldwin in that moment? You've just lost a king because he'd rather run away with his mistress than do his duty, and there's nothing you can do to stop it. What happens next changes everything. The abdication instrument gets drafted. Edward's brother Albert, shy, stuttering, completely unprepared, is told he's about to become King George VI. The entire royal family is in crisis, and Wallis Simpson, alone in a French villa, realizes with growing horror that she's about to become the most hated woman in the world. Because Edward is about to make a radio broadcast. He's going to tell the entire British Empire that he's abandoning the throne, and he's going to blame it on love. But here's what he's not going to tell them: that he never wanted to be king in the first place, that Wallis begged him not to do this, that this isn't a sacrifice, it's an escape. In our next part, we're going to witness the abdication itself. December 10th and 11th, 1936. 48 hours that shocked the world. We'll hear Edward's famous radio broadcast word for word. We'll see Wallis's reaction. We'll watch as Albert becomes George VI, a man so terrified of public speaking he can barely function. And we'll uncover what happened immediately after, the wedding that no royal attended, and the ominous decision to honeymoon at a chateau owned by a Nazi sympathizer. Because the story doesn't end with abdication. In some ways, that's where the real trouble begins. Stay with me. We're about to witness a king throw away the greatest throne on earth, live on radio, in his own words. There are moments in history where you can pinpoint the exact second everything changed. December 10th, 1936, 10 a.m., Fort Belvedere. A king sits at his desk with a fountain pen in his trembling hand, about to sign a document that will erase him from history. And the crazy thing? He's smiling. Because Edward VIII isn't losing his throne. In his mind, he's finally winning his freedom. Let me take you inside those final days, because what happened behind closed doors is even more dramatic than what the public saw. December began with Edward in complete denial. He genuinely believed, truly believed, that somehow, some way, he could have both. The crown and Wallis, the empire and his happiness. He kept telling his advisors, "The people love me, they'll understand." But Stanley Baldwin knew better. On December 2nd, he sat down with Edward for what would be their final negotiation. Baldwin brought the responses from every dominion, every Commonwealth nation. Every single one had rejected the morganatic marriage proposal. Canada said no, Australia said no, New Zealand, South Africa, Ireland, all no. Baldwin laid the papers on Edward's desk. "Your Majesty, you have 3 choices. Give up Mrs. Simpson and remain king. Marry Mrs. Simpson and provoke a constitutional crisis that will likely destroy the monarchy. Or abdicate." Edward didn't even hesitate. "I choose abdication." Baldwin later told colleagues that Edward said it with relief, like a prisoner finally receiving his pardon. But here's where it gets complicated, because while Edward was planning his escape, Wallis was having a complete breakdown in France. Picture Wallis, alone in a villa in Cannes. It's early December, cold and rainy. She's reading British newspapers that are now finally reporting the scandal, and the headlines are vicious. The King's American mistress. Mrs. Simpson, adventuress. Twice divorced woman threatens throne. But worse than the newspapers were the letters, bags and bags of mail forwarded from London, threats, curses, women calling her every name imaginable, men threatening violence. One letter simply read, "We'll throw acid in your face, you American whore." Wallis was terrified. She hadn't left the villa in days. She was having panic attacks, couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. And every time she got Edward on the phone, he'd say the same thing. "Don't worry, darling. Everything will be fine once we're married." Married? Wallis didn't want to marry him anymore. She wanted to disappear. She wanted to go back to being Mrs. Simpson, safely obscure, safely forgotten. On December 7th, Wallis's lawyer, Theodore Goddard, flew to Cannes on a special government-provided plane. Baldwin had sent him with one mission: convince Wallis to withdraw her divorce petition. If she was still married to Ernest, Edward couldn't marry her, and maybe, he'd stay king. Goddard found Wallis in a terrible state. He later reported she was distraught, frightened, and willing to do anything to stop the abdication. Wallis immediately called Edward. "David, I'll withdraw the divorce. I'll go back to Ernest. Just please don't give up the throne." And Edward's response? "It's too late, my darling. I've already made up my mind. Even if you go back to Ernest, I'm still abdicating. I don't want to be king." Let that sink in. Wallis offered to sacrifice everything, her freedom, her future, her relationship with Edward, to save his throne, and he said no, because he never wanted the throne in the first place. Goddard returned to London and reported to Baldwin. "She's ready to do anything, but he won't listen. He wants out." Do you see what happened here? The story everyone tells is that Edward sacrificed everything for love. But the truth is darker and more complex. Edward sacrificed everything to escape duty, and he used Wallis as the excuse. December 10th, 1936, the day of signing. The instrument of abdication was prepared by government lawyers. It was a simple document, really. Just a few sentences that would erase 325 days of kingship. Edward invited his 3 brothers to Fort Belvedere to witness the signing. Albert, Duke of York, who was about to become King George VI, Henry, Duke of Gloucester, and George, Duke of Kent. All 3 looked like they were attending a funeral, because in a way they were. The monarchy they'd known was dying. Their brother was abandoning them, and Albert, shy, stuttering Albert who'd never wanted to be king, was being forced into the role he'd spent his life avoiding. Edward signed his name, Edward R.I., Rex Imperator, King Emperor. His brothers signed as witnesses, and just like that, Edward VIII ceased to exist. The irony is almost poetic, isn't it? Edward abdicated to escape being king, but in doing so he forced his brother into the exact same prison he'd just escaped from. Albert would later tell friends, "I never wanted this. I'm not prepared for this. I'm not even good at public speaking." He had a severe stammer, remember. The idea of giving speeches, doing broadcasts, being the face of the empire, it terrified him. But Albert didn't have a choice. Edward had made his choice for everyone. The abdication instrument was sent to Parliament on the morning of December 11th. MPs debated for hours, though the outcome was never in doubt. This wasn't a decision Parliament made. It was a decision they had to ratify. Edward had already done the deed. At 1:52 p.m., the Declaration of Abdication Act received royal assent. Edward VIII was officially no longer king. His brother was proclaimed King George VI, and Edward became what exactly? The new King George VI immediately granted his brother a title, Duke of Windsor. No longer Your Majesty, but Your Royal Highness. A significant demotion, but still royal. Edward seemed almost giddy. He kept saying, "I'm free, I'm finally free." But there was one more thing he wanted to do. One final act as the former king. He wanted to address the nation, to explain himself, to control the narrative. Baldwin agreed. A BBC radio broadcast was arranged for that evening, 10 p.m. Winston Churchill, one of Edward's few remaining allies, helped him write the speech, and what Edward was about to say would become the most famous abdication speech in history. December 11th, 1936, 10 p.m. Windsor Castle. A small room with a single microphone. Millions of people across the British Empire gathered around their radios. In homes, in pubs, in town squares. The whole world was listening. Edward sat down, took a breath and began. "At long last I'm able to say a few words of my own." His voice was calm, steady, almost cheerful. "I have never wanted to withhold anything, but until now it has not been constitutionally possible for me to speak. A few hours ago I discharged my last duty as king and emperor, and now that I have been succeeded by my brother the Duke of York, my first words must be to declare my allegiance to him. This I do with all my heart." Interesting opening, right? Declaring allegiance to the brother he just abandoned to kingship. Then came the famous line, the one everyone remembers. "You all know the reasons which have impelled me to renounce the throne, but I want you to understand that in making up my mind I did not forget the country or the empire, which, as Prince of Wales and lately as king, I have for 25 years tried to serve. But you must believe me when I tell you that I have found it impossible to carry the heavy burden of responsibility and to discharge my duties as king as I would wish to do without the help and support of the woman I love. The woman I love. 4 words that would define his legacy forever. But listen to what he's actually saying. I can't do this job without her. Not I love her so much I'm willing to give up the throne. No, I need her to do the job, and since I can't have her as queen, I'm leaving." It's subtle, but it's there. This speech is less about love and more about incapacity. He's saying, "I'm not strong enough to be king without her." Edward continued, "And I want you to know that the decision I have made has been mine and mine alone. This was a thing I had to judge entirely for myself. The other person most nearly concerned has tried up to the last to persuade me to take a different course." That line was crucial. He was absolving Wallis of blame, telling the world, "She tried to stop me. This is my choice." But was it true? Yes and no. Wallis did try to stop him in the final days. But for years before that, she'd encouraged his obsession. She'd accepted the jewelry, the attention, the power. She'd played the game. And now Edward was rewriting history to make her look innocent. The speech ended with Edward saying, "And now we all have a new king. I wish him and you, his people, happiness and prosperity with all my heart. God bless you all. God save the king." The broadcast ended. Silence. Then, across Britain, a strange thing happened. Some people wept. Some people cheered. Some people just sat in stunned silence, trying to process what they'd just heard. The king had quit. For a woman. It was unprecedented, unthinkable, and yet it had happened. Within hours, Edward was gone. He left Windsor Castle that very night, driven to Portsmouth where a destroyer was waiting to take him to France, to Wallis. He'd been king for 325 days, not quite a year. His coronation had been scheduled for May 1937, but it would never happen. Those coronation plans would be recycled for his brother George the Whist instead. As Edward's car pulled away from Windsor Castle, his brother, now King George the Whist, stood at a window watching. Sources say George VI was crying, not from sadness that Edward was leaving, but from terror at what he'd just inherited. And in France, Wallis Simpson sat in that villa in Cannes, listening to Edward's broadcast on a crackling radio, and reportedly said to her friends, "What have I done? What have we done?" Because she knew that Edward's speech had just made her the most famous and most hated woman in the world. She knew that Britain would never forgive her. She knew that the royal family would never accept her. And she knew that she'd be forever known as the woman who stole a king, even though she'd tried to give him back. But here's the thing nobody talks about. After the abdication, Edward had to wait. Wallis's divorce wouldn't be final until May 1937. They couldn't marry until then. So for 6 months, Edward lived in exile in Austria, staying with friends, while Wallis remained in France. 6 months of limbo. 6 months of being neither king nor commoner. 6 months of international scandal and gossip. 6 months of watching his brother struggle with a job Edward had dumped on him. And during those 6 months something started to shift. Edward's cheerfulness began to fade. The reality started sinking in. He'd given up everything, power, position, purpose, for a woman he'd known for 5 years. And now he was stuck. He couldn't go back. He could only go forward. And Wallis was stuck too. She couldn't go back to Ernest. He'd already moved on, was seeing someone else. She couldn't back out of marrying Edward. He'd just humiliated himself before the world for her. She was trapped. 2 people who trapped each other. One who'd used love as an escape. One who'd wanted power and gotten exile instead. It's not romantic when you really look at it. It's tragic. Finally, May 3rd, 1937. Wallis's divorce became final. The countdown to their wedding began, and Edward made a decision that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. He chose to marry Wallis at the Château de Candé in France. Sounds romantic, right? A beautiful French chateau. Private. Intimate. Except the Château de Candé was owned by Charles Bedeau, an American-born French industrialist who had, shall we say, interesting political connections, specifically connections to Nazi Germany. Bedeau was what intelligence agencies called an industrial spy. He had business deals throughout Europe, including Germany, and was suspected of passing information to Nazi officials. He owned a villa in Berchtesgaden, the same village where Hitler had his mountain retreat. Why would Edward choose to marry at the home of a Nazi sympathizer? Either he was incredibly naive, or he didn't care, or, and this is what intelligence agencies suspected, he was already making alliances that Britain wouldn't approve of. The wedding was set for June 3rd, 1937. No royal family member would attend, not one. Edward's mother, Queen Mary, refused. His brothers refused. He was marrying in exile at a chateau with dark connections, and the British establishment was pretending it wasn't happening. In our next part, we're going inside that wedding. The ceremony that no royal attended. The dress Wallis chose, blue, not white, because she couldn't wear white as a divorcée. the reverend who performed the ceremony and was immediately ostracised by the Church of England. And then we're following them to Germany. October 1937. The Duke and Duchess of Windsor's infamous tour of Nazi Germany, where they met Hitler, gave Nazi salutes, and praised the Third Reich's economic miracle. Because the abdication wasn't the end of the scandal. In many ways, it was just the beginning, and what happened next would make some historians wonder, did Edward VIII commit treason? Stay with me. We're about to enter the darkest chapter of this story. Imagine planning your wedding and realizing that not a single member of your family will attend. Not your mother, not your brothers, not even a distant cousin. That's what Edward faced in the spring of 1937. The man who'd been King of England 6 months earlier couldn't get one royal to witness his marriage. But what Edward did next, where he chose to marry, who he chose to befriend, and where he decided to honeymoon, would raise questions that historians are still debating today. Was the Duke of Windsor a Nazi sympathiser? Or was he just stunningly, catastrophically naive? Let's start with the wedding itself, because every detail tells a story. June 3rd, 1937, Château de Candé, Loire Valley, France. A beautiful 16th century castle surrounded by manicured gardens. On paper, it sounds perfect, intimate, romantic, far from the judgment of Britain. But remember who owned this chateau? Charles Bedeau. And Charles Bedeau was no ordinary millionaire. Bedeau had made his fortune through efficiency consulting. Basically, he'd go into factories and figure out how to make workers produce more for less pay. Unions hated him. Workers called his methods cruel. But corporations loved him because he saved them money. During the 1920s and 30s, Bedeau had expanded his business into Germany. He worked closely with Nazi officials, helping German industry become more efficient. He had direct access to high-ranking members of the Nazi Party, and intelligence agencies on both sides of the Atlantic suspected, though couldn't prove, that Bedeau was passing information between Germany and other nations. In 1944, Bedeau would be arrested by the FBI on charges of trading with the enemy and treason. He'd commit suicide in prison before trial. But in 1937, he was still operating freely, and Edward either didn't know about his Nazi connections or didn't care. When British officials heard where Edward planned to marry, they were horrified. The Foreign Office sent urgent messages. "Please, Your Royal Highness, choose anywhere else. This looks terrible." Edward ignored them. Bedeau was offering his chateau free of charge. It was private. It was available. That's all Edward cared about. Or was it? Some historians argue Edward knew exactly what he was doing, making a statement to Nazi Germany. I'm available, I'm willing, I'm on your side. We'll come back to that theory. The wedding day arrived, and it was both beautiful and desperately sad. Wallis wore a dress designed by Maine Bochet, a stunning Wallis blue silk crepe gown with a matching blue hat. Not white. Divorcees couldn't wear white. The dress was elegant, sophisticated, and cost the equivalent of about $60,000 in today's money. She wore her hair in her signature style, sleek, severe, centre-parted, and around her neck, one of the many jewellery pieces Edward had given her. She looked every inch a duchess, but her eyes in the photographs look haunted. Edward wore a morning suit. He looked happy, giddy even, free at last. The guest list was pathetically small, 16 people total, a few of Edward's friends who'd stuck by him, Wallis's aunt. That was it. No royals, no family. The British establishment had made their position clear. This marriage doesn't exist to us. The ceremony was performed by Reverend Robert Anderson Jardine, a minister from the Church of England who'd volunteered when no one else would. And here's the tragic part. For agreeing to marry them, Jardine was immediately ostracised by the church. He lost his position. Other clergy refused to associate with him. He'd performed a marriage that, in the church's eyes, shouldn't exist. After the ceremony, there was a small reception, champagne, a wedding cake, polite conversation, and underneath it all, the suffocating awareness that they were pariahs now, exiles, former royalty with no kingdom. Wallis was now the Duchess of Windsor. But here's the insult that would poison her entire life. King George VI issued letters, patent denying her the title, Her Royal Highness. She could be Duchess, but she'd never be HRH. Edward was furious. He saw it as a deliberate humiliation, his brother refusing to grant his wife the respect she deserved. And maybe it was. Or maybe George VI was sending a message. You abandoned us. Now live with the consequences. That denial of HRH became Wallis's obsession for the next 49 years. She'd bring it up constantly. She'd scheme to get it. She'd resent every member of the royal family who had a title she didn't. It ate at her. And you have to wonder, if they'd just given her the title, would any of what happened next have happened? Would the Windsors have been less eager to cozy up to Hitler if Britain had treated them with respect? We'll never know. After the wedding, Edward and Wallis honeymooned in Austria. 3 months of relative peace at a castle lent to them by friends. They hiked, they relaxed. They tried to figure out what their lives would look like now. Because here's the problem. They had no purpose. Edward had spent his entire life being the Prince of Wales, then briefly king. Wallis had spent years climbing the social ladder. Now what? They had money. Edward had negotiated a generous allowance from his brother. They had fame, but they had no job, no responsibilities, no meaning. And into this vacuum stepped Charles Bedaux with a proposal. Why don't you tour Germany? See the workers' housing programs, the factories. It would be educational. Educational? Sure, that's what Bedaux called it. But Bedaux was coordinating with German officials, Nazi officials. This wasn't just a friendly tour, it was a propaganda opportunity. And either Edward was too naive to see it, or he saw it and didn't mind. The British government begged him not to go. Your Royal Highness, this will be seen as an endorsement of the Nazi regime. Please reconsider. Edward's response, I'm a private citizen now. I can do what I want. Technically true, but Edward wasn't just any private citizen. He was the former King of England. Everything he did reflected on Britain whether he liked it or not. So in October 1937, less than a year after his abdication, the Duke and Duchess of Windsor arrived in Germany for a 2-week tour that would stain their reputation forever. October 11th, 1937. The Windsors' train pulled into Berlin, and what greeted them was shocking. Massive crowds, Nazi flags everywhere, and German officials treating them like visiting royalty. Robert Ley, leader of the German Labour Front, personally escorted them. Ley was a hardcore Nazi, an alcoholic, and a vicious anti-Semite. He'd later be charged with war crimes at Nuremberg, but in October 1937, he was the Windsor's tour guide. And here's where things get disturbing. As the Duke and Duchess toured German factories and housing projects, crowds would greet them with Nazi salutes. And Edward? Edward would salute back. There's photographic evidence. Multiple photos of Edward giving the Nazi salute, his arm outstretched. Heil Hitler. Now defenders argue he was just being polite. When in Rome, you know. When people salute you, you salute back. It didn't mean anything political. But come on. Edward had been a monarch. He knew the power of symbols. He knew what a photograph meant. And he gave the Nazi salute anyway, multiple times, on camera. Wallis also gave the salute, though less frequently. but she was photographed smiling, laughing, clearly enjoying herself. The Nazis rolled out the red carpet, took them to the Mason porcelain factory because they'd heard Wallis loved China, threw elaborate dinners, treated her like the queen she'd never be. And Wallis loved it. For the first time since the abdication, she was being treated with the respect and ceremony she craved. October 22nd, 1937. Berchtesgaden, Hitler's mountain retreat. The moment everyone had been waiting for. The Duke and Duchess of Windsor were driven up the mountain to meet Adolf Hitler himself. They spent about an hour with him. The meeting was private. No official transcript exists, but people who were there later reported what was discussed. Hitler was charming, spoke respectfully about Edward's modernization efforts as king, praised him for recognizing that workers needed better housing, better conditions. They talked about communism, their mutual enemy. They talked about Britain and Germany working together instead of against each other. And Edward? Edward was impressed. He later told friends that Hitler was a great man who'd done a good job in Germany. He praised the reduction in unemployment, the new roads, the infrastructure projects. What Edward didn't mention, or chose not to see, was how that unemployment reduction happened. Through rearmament, through building weapons, through preparing for war. The workers weren't building houses, they were building tanks. Edward also didn't mention the persecution of Jews that was already well underway. By October 1937, Jewish businesses were being boycotted. Jewish professionals were being stripped of their licenses. The Nuremberg laws had been in effect for 2 years. The writing was on the wall. But Edward saw what he wanted to see: order, efficiency, national pride. The things he'd always admired about Germany as a child. After the meeting, Edward wrote a thank you letter to Hitler. The letter has been preserved in archives. In it, Edward thanks Hitler for the wonderful time and says the trip made a great impression on us. Let me repeat that. The former King of England thanked Adolf Hitler for a wonderful time, in writing. The tour continued. They visited a concentration camp Dachau had been operating since 1933. But the Nazis carefully stage-managed what the Windsors saw. Clean barracks, healthy-looking prisoners doing light labour. It was all theatre, designed to make the camps look like harmless detention centres, rather than the brutal sites of torture and murder they actually were. And Edward? Edward said he was favourably impressed by what he saw. Either he was the most naive man alive, or he was willfully blind. Or, and this is what terrifies historians, he knew exactly what was happening and approved. The tour also included meetings with other Nazi officials. Rudolf Hess, Hitler's deputy, Hermann Göring, commander of the Luftwaffe. Edward met them at Göring's estate, Karin Hall, where Göring showed off his art collection, much of it stolen from Jewish families, though Edward didn't ask questions. Göring had a map on his wall showing Austria as part of Germany, the Anschluss that would happen 5 months later. Wallis noticed it, and later wrote about Göring's amusement when she pointed it out. Edward said nothing, didn't challenge it, just let the moment pass. Throughout the tour, Edward gave speeches praising Germany's achievements. At one German Labour Front meeting he said, and I'm quoting from the transcript, "I have travelled the world and my upbringing has made me familiar with the great achievements of mankind, but that which I have seen in Germany I had hitherto believed to be impossible. It cannot be grasped and is a miracle. One can only begin to understand it when one realizes that behind it all is one man and one will. One man, one will." He was praising Hitler's dictatorship as a miracle. Can you imagine the horror back in Britain? Their former king, who'd abdicated less than a year ago, was in Germany praising Hitler, giving Nazi salutes, calling Nazi Germany a miracle. The international reaction was swift and brutal. American newspapers ran headlines like, "Duke of Windsor praises Hitler." British papers, always more restrained, still made it clear this was a disaster. The British government immediately cancelled a planned American tour the Windsors had scheduled. They couldn't allow Edward and Wallis to go to America right after praising Nazi Germany. The optics would be catastrophic. The Windsors were furious. They felt they were being punished for nothing. Edward genuinely seemed to believe he was just being a goodwill ambassador, promoting peace between nations. But British intelligence saw something far more sinister. They'd been monitoring the Windsors' communications, and they were seeing disturbing patterns. Letters between the Windsors and German officials, conversations about a restored monarchy if Germany won a war against Britain. Was Edward plotting with the Nazis? Was he positioning himself as a potential puppet king if Germany invaded Britain? The intelligence services couldn't prove it, but they couldn't rule it out either, and that uncertainty was terrifying. What drives someone to do what Edward did? Was it genuine Nazi sympathy? Was it resentment toward Britain for rejecting Wallis? Was it naivety? Or was it something darker, ambition to reclaim power through Germany? I think it was a mix. Edward genuinely believed Germany was a bulwark against Soviet communism. He admired efficiency and order. He resented Britain for humiliating him and Wallis. And yes, I think part of him, maybe a small part, maybe a large part, entertained fantasies of being restored to power if Germany won. Wallis, for her part, just wanted to be treated like royalty, and Germany gave her that. They called her Her Royal Highness, even though Britain wouldn't. They rolled out red carpets. They made her feel important. Two damaged people making catastrophically bad decisions because they were too proud to admit they'd made a mistake. And the worst part? This was just the beginning. Because when World War II broke out 2 years later, the Windsors would be in France, and Germany would have plans for them. Plans that involved kidnapping, coercion, and a plot to install Edward as a Nazi puppet king. In our next part, we're diving into the war years. September 1939, war breaks out, and the Windsors are suddenly a security risk. We'll uncover Operation Willy, the Nazi plot to kidnap the Duke of Windsor and use him against Britain. We'll see Churchill scrambling to get the Windsors out of Europe. We'll witness the Bahamas exile, a gilded cage designed to keep Edward away from Hitler. And we'll reveal the Marburg Files, 60 pages of correspondence between the Windsors and Nazi high command that Churchill desperately tried to suppress. Because the question isn't just, did Edward sympathise with the Nazis? The question is, did Edward commit treason? And the documents suggest the answer might be yes. Stay with me. We're entering the darkest chapter of this story. The chapter where a love affair becomes entangled with espionage, betrayal, and a plot that could have changed the outcome of World War II. September 1st, 1939. German tanks rolled into Poland. 2 days later, Britain and France declared war on Germany. And somewhere in the south of France, the Duke and Duchess of Windsor suddenly realised they'd made a catastrophic miscalculation. Because when you've spent the last 2 years cozying up to Nazi Germany, and then that same Germany starts a war against your home country, well, let's just say people start asking uncomfortable questions. Questions like, whose side are you really on? When war broke out, Edward and Wallis were living in the south of France, in a rented villa near Antibes. They'd been there since their disastrous Germany tour, essentially in self-imposed exile. Britain didn't want them. America didn't want them. So they lived in limbo, throwing parties, spending money, and pretending everything was fine. Then Poland fell, and everything changed. Edward immediately contacted the British government. I want to serve. Give me a position. Let me help the war effort. Now, You have to appreciate the audacity here. This is the man who'd abandoned the throne less than 3 years earlier, who'd praised Hitler publicly, who'd given Nazi salutes on camera, and now he wanted Britain to trust him with a wartime role. To everyone's surprise, Churchill, who'd been one of Edward's few allies during the abdication, advocated for giving him something. Not anything important, but something to keep him occupied and out of trouble. So Edward was made a liaison officer with a French military mission. His job was basically to assess French military readiness and report back to British intelligence. And here's the ironic part. Edward was actually good at it. He toured the Maginot Line, France's supposedly impregnable defensive fortifications. He inspected French troops, and his reports were shockingly accurate. Edward reported back, "The French are completely unprepared. The Maginot Line has massive gaps. Morale is terrible. If Germany attacks through Belgium, France will fall within weeks." British intelligence received these reports and filed them away, ignored them. Because how could they trust information from Edward, the man who'd praised Hitler, who had German connections? So they dismissed his warnings. And 6 months later, in May 1940, Germany invaded through Belgium, exactly as Edward predicted. France fell in 6 weeks, and Edward's reports, gathering dust in some filing cabinet, turned out to be completely accurate. But by then, nobody cared about Edward's intelligence work, because France was collapsing, and Edward and Wallis were suddenly in very real danger. May 1940. The German army was sweeping through France like wildfire. The French government was in chaos, and the Windsors were in Paris trying to figure out how to escape. They finally fled south, driving through masses of refugees heading for the Spanish border. And here's where the story gets truly bizarre. Because Germany knew exactly where they were, and Germany had plans for them. The Windsors made it to Spain by late June. They were staying in Madrid as guests of Spanish officials, safe for the moment. The British government immediately sent a telegram, "Return to Britain at once." But Edward didn't want to return to Britain. He sent back a list of demands. "I'll come back if you guarantee Wallis will be received by the King and Queen. I'll come back if you give her the title HRH. I'll come back if you give me a meaningful job." Can you imagine? France is falling. Britain is facing potential invasion, and Edward is negotiating about his wife's title. Churchill was furious. He sent another telegram, this one more forceful. "You are under military orders. Return immediately or face court-martial." Edward as a major general in the British Army, which meant he was subject to military law. If he refused a direct order during wartime, he could be tried for desertion. But still, Edward stalled. Days passed, then weeks. The Windsors moved from Spain to Portugal, to a villa outside Lisbon. And this is where Operation Willy begins. Operation Willy. Even the name sounds like something out of a spy novel. But it was real, and it was terrifying. German intelligence had been monitoring the Windsors' movements, and they saw an opportunity. If they could convince Edward to stay in Europe, or better yet, kidnap him, they could use him as a propaganda tool, maybe even install him as a puppet king if Germany successfully invaded Britain. Hitler personally approved the operation. He assigned Walter Schellenberg, one of his top SS intelligence officers, to handle it. Schellenberg flew to Spain, then Portugal, to put the plan in motion. The plan had multiple stages. First, try to convince Edward to stay in Europe voluntarily, offer him safety, money, influence. Tell him that Germany would win the war and he'd be better off on the winning side. If that didn't work, kidnap him. There were cooperative Spanish border officials who'd look the other way, get the Windsors over the border into Spain, then keep them there for their own safety, and if kidnapping didn't work, Well, Schellenberg had orders to use any means necessary. The implication was clear. They'd kill Wallis if it meant securing Edward's cooperation. German agents made contact with the Windsors through intermediaries. Miguel Primo de Rivera, a Spanish aristocrat with Nazi sympathies, visited them multiple times. He'd relay messages. Germany wants peace with Britain. The Duke could be instrumental in achieving that peace. Why go back to a country that rejected you? And Edward? Edward listened. He didn't say yes, but he didn't say no either. He kept having these meetings, kept discussing possibilities. British intelligence was monitoring all of this, by the way. They were reading decoded German telegrams. They could see what Germany was planning, and they were terrified. Churchill sent increasingly desperate messages. Leave Portugal now. A Royal Navy ship is waiting in Lisbon harbour to take you to the Bahamas. Go, now. The Bahamas. That was Churchill's solution. Make Edward governor of the Bahamas, a British colony in the Caribbean. It was a real job with real responsibilities. But it was also as far away from Europe as Churchill could send him. It was a gilded cage. Edward would have a title, a salary, a residence. But he'd be thousands of miles from Hitler, thousands of miles from any opportunity to betray Britain. Edward initially refused. The Bahamas? That was an insult. A backwater posting for a failed king. But Churchill made it clear. This wasn't a request. Either you go to the Bahamas, or you'll be recalled to Britain and confined, possibly arrested. Your choice. Behind the scenes, Churchill was dealing with something even more alarming. British intelligence had intercepted German telegrams about Operation Willy. One telegram, sent from the German ambassador in Lisbon to Ribbentrop in Berlin, reported that Edward had said he intended to postpone his departure as long as possible, in hope of a turn of events favourable to him. A turn of events favourable to him. What did that mean? Did Edward want Germany to win? Was he waiting to see if Britain would fall before deciding which side to join? Another telegram reported that Edward had criticised Churchill's policies and expressed doubts about Britain's ability to win the war. He allegedly said that continued bombing of Britain would make the country ready for peace, meaning ready to surrender. These were German reports, so we have to take them with some skepticism. The Nazis might have been exaggerating or misinterpreting Edward's words to make themselves look good. But the fact that Edward was having these conversations at all, that's the thing that haunts historians. Why was Edward talking to German intermediaries during wartime? Why wasn't he immediately reporting these contacts to British authorities? Finally, on August 1st, 1940, more than a month after Churchill had first ordered him to leave, Edward and Wallis boarded a ship for the Bahamas. But even then, the drama wasn't over. German agents allegedly planted a false bomb threat on their ship, hoping to delay departure. It didn't work. The ship sailed, and Schellenberg's Operation Willy ended in failure. The Nazis never got their puppet king. But here's the terrifying what if. What if Edward had stayed in Europe? What if he'd accepted German protection? If Britain had fallen, and in the summer of 1940 it looked very possible, would Edward have allowed himself to be installed as a Nazi puppet king? We'll never know for certain. But the fact that Churchill was worried enough to essentially exile Edward speaks volumes. The Windsors arrived in Nassau, Bahamas in August 1940, and almost immediately it was clear this was going to be a disaster. Edward's first act as governor was to request $20,000, about $3 million today, to refurbish the governor's residence during wartime, while Britain was being bombed. He wanted money to redecorate his house. The request was denied, obviously. But it showed how completely disconnected Edward was from reality. His country was fighting for survival, and he was worried about wallpaper. The Windsors also brought their lavish lifestyle to the Bahamas, Massive parties, expensive clothes, Wallis ordering gowns from Paris even though German submarines were sinking supply ships in the Atlantic. It was tone-deaf and offensive. The local population didn't help matters. The Bahamas had a rigid racial hierarchy, white elites ruling over a black majority with little political power, and the Windsors, rather than challenging the system, embraced it. They socialized exclusively with white plantation owners. They made no effort to improve conditions for black Bahamians. There was one exception. Edward did push for a labor reform program after a riot in 1942. But even that was half-hearted. He saw it as maintaining order, not achieving justice. Meanwhile, back in Europe, the war raged on, and documents kept surfacing that made Edward look worse and worse. The Marburg Files. This is the smoking gun that historians have been arguing about for 80 years. In 1945, as the Allies advanced into Germany, American troops discovered a cache of documents in Marburg Castle. 60 pages of correspondence between German officials and the Duke of Windsor. The files included telegrams from 1940 during Operation Willy, German reports of conversations with Edward, records of what Edward had allegedly said about Britain, about Churchill, about his willingness to work with Germany. One document reported that Edward was a firm supporter of a peaceful compromise with Germany, and believed that continued heavy bombing would make England ready for peace. Another suggested that Germany had promised Edward restoration to the British throne if Germany won the war. When these files were discovered, Churchill immediately classified them. Top secret. He wanted them destroyed. He wrote to President Eisenhower, "I think these documents should be suppressed, or at least their publication delayed for 10 or 20 years. Why? If Edward was innocent, why suppress the evidence?" The files were eventually published in 1957 over Churchill's objections, and when reporters asked the Duke of Windsor about them, he called them complete fabrications. But historians who've studied the documents say they're consistent with other intelligence reports from the period. The German officials who wrote these reports had no reason to lie. They were internal communications, not propaganda. So either Edward really did discuss working with Germany, or German officials completely invented these conversations. And if they invented them, why would Churchill want to suppress them? Wouldn't he want to publish proof that the Germans were lying? The most likely explanation is that the documents contain a mix of truth and exaggeration. Edward probably did say things that could be interpreted as sympathetic to Germany. German officials probably embellished or misinterpreted his words to make themselves look better to Hitler. But even giving Edward the benefit of the doubt, he shouldn't have been having these conversations at all. For the rest of the war, Edward remained in the Bahamas. It was 5 years of exile, boredom and resentment. He and Wallis threw parties to maintain some semblance of their former life, but they were trapped, forgotten, irrelevant. Edward would later claim he'd served his country honourably during the war, that he'd done his duty as governor. But the truth is more complicated. He'd been exiled because he was a security risk. He'd been kept away from Europe because Churchill didn't trust him near German influence, and documents suggest, though don't definitively prove, that he'd been willing to betray Britain if it meant regaining power. Was Edward a traitor? Legally, no. He was never charged with any crime. But morally? That's a harder question. I think Edward was a weak man who made terrible choices. I think he resented Britain for rejecting Wallis, and that resentment made him vulnerable to German manipulation. I think he entertained fantasies of restoration, and those fantasies led him into conversations he should never have had. And Wallis? Wallis was along for the ride. She wanted to be queen. She wanted respect. And if Germany offered her that respect, she wasn't going to ask too many questions about the cost. 2 people, 2 sets of terrible decisions, 2 lives that would never recover from the choices they made. In our next part, we're finally moving past the war. It's 1945, Germany has fallen, and the Windsors are trying to figure out what comes next. They can't go back to Britain, not really. So they settle in France, in a series of increasingly lavish homes, and spend the next 27 years in permanent exile. We'll see Edward's slow decline, the drinking, the bitterness, the realization that he threw away everything for nothing. We'll witness the visits from Queen Elizabeth II, awkward and painful, and we'll be there for Edward's death in 1972, when Wallis finally understands the price she paid for those jewels, those yachts, and that fleeting taste of almost being queen. Because the love story ended in the Bahamas, what came after was just two people trapped together, living with regrets. Stay with me. We're entering the final chapters of this extraordinary tragic story. What do you do when you've thrown away a kingdom for love, endured wartime exile, survived espionage plots, and finally the war ends? You'd think Edward and Wallis would return to Britain triumphant, vindicated, ready to rebuild their lives. Instead, they returned to a country that wanted nothing to do with them. And so began 27 years of permanent exile, a slow, golden decline into bitterness, alcohol, and the crushing realization that they'd sacrificed everything for nothing. May 8th, 1945, Victory in Europe Day. All across Britain, people poured into the streets celebrating. King George VI and Queen Elizabeth appeared on the Buckingham Palace balcony with their daughters, Elizabeth and Margaret, waving to ecstatic crowds. The royal family had stayed in London throughout the Blitz. They'd shared the suffering. They'd earned the love of their people. And where were Edward and Wallis? Still in the Bahamas, still exiled, still forgotten. Edward wrote to his mother, Queen Mary, suggesting he might return to Britain now that the war was over. Maybe take up residence at Fort Belvedere, his old country house. Maybe resume some royal duties. Queen Mary's response was ice cold. That would not be possible. Not, we need to discuss this. Not perhaps in time. Just, that would not be possible. The royal family had made their decision. Edward had abandoned the throne, cozied up to the Nazis, and become a security liability. He could never come back. Not really. He could visit for funerals or special occasions. But live in Britain? Serve the monarchy? Absolutely not. And suddenly, Edward and Wallis faced a question they'd been avoiding for 9 years. What now? What do we do with the rest of our lives? They settled in France, partly because France didn't judge them the way Britain did, partly because they could live there tax-free if they were careful about their residency status, and partly because, well, where else could they go? In 1952 they leased a stunning property, Le Moulin de la Tuilerie, a converted mill outside Paris. It sat on 10 acres of gardens. It had been owned by Etienne de Beaumont, a French artist and socialite. The place was idyllic. Rose gardens, a pool, absolute privacy. But maintaining it required money. Lots of money. And while Edward had his allowance from the British royal family, about $10,000 per year, which sounds like a lot but wasn't enough for the lifestyle they wanted, they needed more. So Edward did something that horrified the royal family. He wrote his memoirs. A King's Story, the memoirs of the Duke of Windsor, was published in 1947. In it, Edward laid out his version of events. The Abdication was a great love story. Britain had been cruel and unfair. Wallis was innocent. The book was a bestseller. It made Edward a fortune, the equivalent of several $1 million today. But it also burned every bridge he had left with the royal family. You don't write a tell-all memoir about the monarchy and expect to be welcomed back for Christmas dinner. Wallis didn't write her memoir until later. The Heart Has Its Reasons came out in 1956, and it was even more self-serving than Edward's. She positioned herself as the innocent victim, the woman who never wanted to be queen, who tried to stop Edward from abdicating. Which was partly true, but conveniently ignored all the years she'd encouraged his obsession and accepted his increasingly extravagant gifts. Between the memoirs, some questionable currency trading deals, Edward was investigated multiple times for illegal currency exchanges, and the sale of royal properties back to George VI, the Windsors maintained their lavish lifestyle. But here's the thing about living in permanent exile. You have nothing to do, no purpose, no responsibilities, just endless days of parties, shopping, and trying to stay relevant. The Windsors became fixtures of the international jet set. They'd summer in the south of France, winter in Paris, occasionally visit New York. They threw legendary parties. Wallis's dinner parties were famous for their impeccable style. Perfect food, perfect wine, perfect conversation. She obsessed over every detail. But people who attended these parties later described them as strangely sad. Edward would drink too much and ramble about how Britain had betrayed him. Wallis would smile her fixed smile and change the subject, both of them performing for an audience that was slowly losing interest. Because here's the brutal truth. By the 1950s, the world had moved on. Edward's abdication was old news. There were new scandals, new celebrities. The Windsors were yesterday's story, desperately trying to stay in the spotlight. And their relationship, it was curdling. Edward's obsessive devotion hadn't lessened. He still followed Wallis around like a puppy, still sought her approval for everything. But Wallis? Wallis was growing resentful. She'd given up her life in London, her marriage to Ernest, her safety and security. For what? To live in exile with a man who'd proven himself weak, politically naive, and increasingly alcoholic. She'd wanted to be queen. Instead, she was Duchess of Windsor, denied the title Her Royal Highness, snubbed by every European royal family. Friends reported that Wallis could be cruel to Edward. She'd mock him in front of guests. She'd make cutting remarks about his appearance, his intelligence, his failures, and Edward would just take it. Because he needed her. She was all he had. Biographers have described it as a sadomasochistic relationship. Edward needed to be dominated, and Wallis needed someone to blame for her disappointments. They were locked together in a toxic dynamic neither could escape. There were occasional moments of reconciliation with the royal family, but they were always strained, awkward, painful. In February 1952, King George VI died. He was only 56, worn down by the stress of kingship, by the chain smoking that gave him lung cancer. The brother who'd never wanted to be king, who'd been thrust into the role by Edward's abdication, was dead. Edward flew to Britain for the funeral. Alone. Wallis stayed in France. She wasn't invited, and she knew she wouldn't be welcome. Edward stood in St. George's Chapel watching his brother's coffin and reportedly wept. But were they tears of grief, or guilt, or just self-pity? After the funeral, Edward met with his mother, Queen Mary. She was 84 years old, frail but still imposing. They sat in a room at Marlborough House, and according to people who were there, Queen Mary said something like, "You killed your brother. The stress of the throne that should have been yours, it killed him." True or not, that's what Edward believed she said, and it haunted him. Queen Mary died the following year in March 1953. And again Edward returned to Britain for the funeral. Again without Wallis. Again standing alone, the black sheep of the family. But something shifted after Queen Mary's death. With the old guard gone, maybe there was room for reconciliation. The new queen, Elizabeth II, George VI's daughter, was more pragmatic than her grandparents. She didn't hate Edward and Wallis, she just found them embarrassing and irrelevant. But she also understood that completely ostracizing them looked petty and cruel. So in 1967, 31 years after the abdication, Elizabeth finally invited the Duke and Duchess of Windsor to attend an official public ceremony, the unveiling of a plaque dedicated to Queen Mary. It was the first time Wallis had been officially recognised by the royal family in public. She and Edward stood there, elderly now, watching the ceremony, and Wallis reportedly cried. After 3 decades of being snubbed, someone finally acknowledged her existence. But it was too little, too late. The damage was irreversible. By the late 1960s, Edward's health was failing. He was a lifelong smoker, multiple packs a day, and it was catching up with him. He developed a persistent cough, lost weight, looked gaunt. In 1971, doctors diagnosed him with throat cancer. Inoperable. They gave him months to live. And here's where Queen Elizabeth II did something genuinely kind. She visited them. In May 1972, during a state visit to France, she made time to visit the Windsors at their Paris home, Villa Windsor. It was a brief visit, just 15 minutes. But for Edward, lying in bed, dying, seeing his niece the Queen, it meant everything. They talked quietly. Elizabeth was gracious, warm even. She told him he'd be remembered for his modernisation efforts as Prince of Wales, for his care for working people. She tried to give him some dignity at the end, and Edward, barely able to speak, thanked her for coming, for not completely erasing him from history. Edward died 10 days later, on May 28th, 1972. He was 77 years old. The man who'd been king for 11 months had lived 36 years in exile. His body was flown back to Britain for burial, and in a gesture that surprised many, the royal family invited Wallis to stay at Buckingham Palace for the funeral. The first and only time she'd sleep under that roof. On the day of the funeral, Wallis stood at Windsor Castle watching the annual Trooping of Colours, the Queen's birthday parade, from a window. A photographer with a telephoto lens captured her face. She looked utterly bereft, lost, like she couldn't quite believe this was her life. Later, at the funeral, Wallis sat in the front row of St. George's Chapel, the same chapel where Edward's brother's funeral had been held, the same chapel where Edward himself had once expected to be crowned. The Queen was there, Prince Philip, Prince Charles, all the royals who'd spent decades pretending Wallis didn't exist. And now here she was, the widow, at her husband's funeral, finally being acknowledged. But what was she thinking? Was she mourning? Was she relieved? Was she reflecting on what might have been? We'll never really know, because after the funeral, Wallis returned to Paris, to Villa Windsor, and slowly began to disappear from public life. The thing is, Edward's death didn't free Wallis, it trapped her, because suddenly she was alone for the first time in decades. The man who'd obsessed over her, who'd given up a throne for her, who'd devoted his entire existence to her, was gone. And what did she have to show for it? A title without Her Royal Highness, a house in Paris, jewellery that reminded her of everything she'd lost, and memories of a life that had promised so much and delivered so little. Friends who visited Wallis in the years after Edward's death described her as hollow. She'd throw dinner parties out of habit, but she'd barely speak. She'd sit at the head of the table, the perfect hostess, but her eyes were empty. She started having health problems, heart issues, then dementia. By the early 1980s, Wallis couldn't remember who people were, couldn't remember where she was. Some days she'd ask for Edward, forgetting he was dead. She lived alone in Villa Windsor, cared for by servants and a lawyer who managed her affairs. The royal family occasionally checked on her, more out of obligation than affection, and the world slowly forgot about her. Have you ever wondered what it's like to outlive your relevance? To have been the centre of the world's attention and then just fade away? Wallis Simpson lived that nightmare for 14 years. The irony is almost too perfect. Wallis had climbed from poverty to nearly becoming queen. She'd captivated a king. She'd caused a constitutional crisis. She'd been the most talked about woman in the world, and she ended up alone, forgotten, confused, in a house full of memories she could no longer access. Edward had sacrificed a throne for her, but in the end, what did either of them really gain? They had each other, yes, but was that enough? Was 35 years of exile, bitterness and resentment worth the brief thrill of scandalous romance? I don't think Edward ever questioned it. He died believing he'd made the right choice. That love had been worth the sacrifice. But Wallis? I think Wallis knew. I think in her clearer moments before the dementia took over completely, she understood exactly what the cost had been, and I think it destroyed her. In our next part, we're going to witness Wallis's final years, the slow, sad decline into dementia and death. We'll be there for her last days, when a woman who'd once dazzled the world could barely recognise her own reflection. We'll uncover what happened to all that jewellery, the millions of dollars worth of gems that Edward had showered her with, and we'll explore the will she left behind, the one that shocked everyone by leaving almost nothing to the royal family and everything to medical research. Because even at the end, Wallis Simpson had one last surprise, and then, finally, we'll step back and ask the question that's haunted this entire story. Was it love? Really? Or was it something darker, more complicated, more tragic than any fairy tale could capture? Stay with me. We're almost at the end of this extraordinary journey. Just 2 more parts to go. There's something uniquely cruel about losing your mind slowly. One day, you remember everything. Every triumph, every regret, every moment that defined your life. And then, piece by piece, those memories dissolve until you're left in a fog, reaching for things that aren't there anymore. That was Wallis Simpson's final chapter. 14 years of slow erasure, watching herself disappear, until finally, mercifully, it ended. But before we get to that ending, we need to talk about what really happened in those years after Edward died. Because the official story, lonely widow grieving in Paris, that's only half the truth. The other half involves missing jewellery, suspicious lawyers, and a question that still haunts historians. Did Wallis Simpson ever actually love Edward VIII? In the immediate aftermath of Edward's funeral in June 1972, Wallis returned to Villa Windsor in Paris. She was 75 years old, and suddenly her entire identity, the Duke's wife, had evaporated. Friends who visited her in those first months described her as completely lost. She'd wander through the villa, touching Edward's belongings. His clothes still hung in the closet. His reading glasses sat on the bedside table. She couldn't bring herself to change anything. But here's what's interesting. While Wallis seemed devastated publicly, privately some people noticed something else. Relief. Cecil Beaton, the famous photographer who'd known the Windsors for decades, visited Wallis a few weeks after Edward's death. He later wrote in his diary that Wallis seemed lighter, almost liberated. She was performing grief, yes, but underneath, Beaton sensed freedom. Because the truth is, Living with Edward's obsessive devotion had been exhausting. 35 years of being worshipped, controlled and blamed for everything. 35 years of Edward following her around, seeking her approval, making her responsible for his happiness. That's not love. That's a life sentence. So maybe, just maybe, part of Wallis was relieved to finally be alone. But being alone also meant being vulnerable, and Wallis had a lot of people circling, waiting to take advantage. Let's talk about the jewellery, because this is where things get really murky. Remember all those pieces Edward had given Wallis over the years? The emerald engagement ring, the flamingo brooch, the Cartier bracelets. We're talking about a collection estimated to be worth over $50 million in today's money. Maybe more. Wallis kept these pieces in the villa's safe. They were her security, her nest egg. If she ever needed money, she could sell a bracelet or a necklace. But shortly after Edward's death, pieces started disappearing. At first it was small things. A brooch she thought she'd packed for a trip but couldn't find. A bracelet that wasn't where she remembered leaving it. Wallis would ask her staff, "Have you seen my sapphire clip?" And they'd shake their heads. Then larger pieces went missing. The famous flamingo brooch, some of the Cartier bracelets. What was happening? There are several theories. One, Wallis, in her grief and confusion, was misplacing things. She was getting older, starting to show early signs of dementia. Maybe she simply forgot where she put things. Two, staff members were stealing. With Edward gone, there was less oversight. A maid or butler could pocket a piece, sell it, and claim ignorance. 3. Maître Suzanne Blum, Wallis's lawyer, was systematically looting the collection. This is the theory many historians believe, and it's disturbing. Maître Suzanne Blum entered Wallis's life in the mid-1970s. She was a fierce, controlling Parisian lawyer who'd represented other wealthy clients, and she quickly became Wallis's gatekeeper, controlling who could visit, who could call, what information got in or out. At first, this seemed protective. Wallis was vulnerable. She needed someone to manage her affairs. But Blum's control became increasingly absolute and increasingly suspicious. Friends who tried to visit Wallis would be turned away at the door. The Duchess is not well enough for visitors. Phone calls wouldn't be returned. Letters went unanswered. It was as if Wallis had been placed under house arrest in her own home. And during this period of isolation, more jewellery disappeared. Not just pieces, entire sets. Collections that should have been there weren't. When the royal family's representatives tried to check on Wallis and inventory the jewellery, remember some pieces were actually royal property that Edward had given to Wallis. Blum blocked them. The Duchess values her privacy. There were rumours, never proven, that Blum was selling pieces and pocketing the money, or giving them to friends, or squirreling them away for herself. When Blum died in 1994, 8 years after Wallis, some of these pieces surfaced in estate sales, pieces that should have been in Wallis's estate. How did Blum have them? To this day, nobody knows exactly what happened to all of Wallis's jewellery. Some pieces were eventually auctioned by Sotheby's in 1987, after Wallis's death, raising millions for charity. But other pieces just gone, vanished, either lost, stolen or hidden by people who knew Wallis couldn't stop them. By 1980, Wallis's dementia was undeniable. She'd have good days where she'd be lucid, charming herself, and then bad days where she'd think she was still married to Ernest Simpson, or back in Baltimore as a young girl, or waiting for Edward to come home from an event. Her staff would find her wandering the villa at night, calling for David, Edward's family name. David? David, where are you? Sometimes she'd get angry, accusing people of stealing from her, which, given what was happening with the jewellery, wasn't entirely wrong, but her accusations were scattered, confused. She'd blame a maid for taking something that was still in the safe, or insist someone had stolen a dress she'd given away years ago. It was heartbreaking. This woman who'd been so sharp, so clever, so in control of every social situation, was disappearing into fog. The royal family, to their credit, didn't completely abandon her. Queen Elizabeth would send representatives to check on her welfare. Prince Charles visited once or twice, but these were duty calls, not warmth. They were making sure she wasn't destitute or abused. That was it. Wallis spent her final years essentially imprisoned in Villa Windsor, bedridden, barely eating, fed through a tube when she refused food. Some days she'd recognise her nurse, other days she wouldn't. And the cruelest part? She still had moments of clarity, moments where the fog would lift and she'd remember everything. Who she was, what had happened, what she'd lost. Can you imagine? Having those brief moments of awareness, knowing you're losing your mind, knowing this is how your story ends. April 24th, 1986. Villa Windsor. Wallis Simpson died quietly in her sleep. She was 89 years old. The official cause of death was cardiovascular disease. But really, she'd been dying for years. Her body had just finally caught up to her mind. The funeral was held at St. George's Chapel, Windsor Castle, the same place where Edward had been buried 14 years earlier, and this time the turnout was minimal. Queen Elizabeth attended, along with Prince Philip and Prince Charles, a few other royals, some elderly friends from the old days, but it was a small, quiet affair. No grand ceremony, no national mourning. Just a brief service for a woman who'd once threatened to become queen. Wallis was buried next to Edward at the Royal Burial Ground, Frogmore. They'd be together forever, just as Edward always wanted. But here's the question that haunted everyone at that funeral. Had Wallis wanted this? To be buried at Frogmore in Britain next to Edward? Or would she have preferred to be somewhere else, anywhere else? Far from the royal family that had made her life hell? We'll never know. Because by the time decisions were being made about her burial, Wallis couldn't speak for herself. Blum made the arrangements, and Blum decided, next to Edward. Forever. And then came the will. Oh, the will. Everyone expected Wallis to leave a substantial portion of her estate to the royal family, or to Edward's relatives. Some gesture toward the family she'd married into. Instead, almost nothing to the royals. The bulk of Wallis's estate, estimated at around $10 to $15 million, although much of the jewellery was already missing, went to the Pasteur Institute, a leading medical research organisation in France, specifically for AIDS research. This was 1986, remember. The AIDS crisis was at its height, and Wallis, of all people, decided her legacy would be fighting this disease. Why? Some people saw it as redemption. A woman who'd been blamed for everything, trying to do something good with the money left to her. Others saw it as a final insult to the royal family. You didn't give me respect in life? Fine. You get nothing in death. Still others think it was Blum's idea, not Wallis's, that Blum had controlled Wallis's will the same way she'd controlled everything else in those final years. We'll never know for sure. But the Pasteur Institute got the money, and they used it well. Wallis Simpson's jewellery, the gems Edward had given her to say, "You belong to me," helped fund research that would save thousands of lives. There's poetry in that, don't you think? But here's the question we've been dancing around this entire story. Did Wallis ever love Edward? Modern historians are increasingly sceptical. Let's look at the evidence. Anne Seber, who wrote That Woman, The Life of Wallis Simpson, argues that Wallis was still in love with Ernest Simpson when Edward entered the picture. She never intended to leave Ernest. The affair with Edward was supposed to be temporary, a fling, a bit of excitement, but then Edward abdicated, and suddenly Wallis was trapped. Andrew Loney, author of Traitor King, goes further. He argues that Edward was emotionally stunted with undying dog-like devotion to Wallis in what was essentially a sadomasochistic partnership. Loney doesn't believe Wallis ever loved Edward, and remember those rumours about Wallis's affair with Ribbentrop, the 17 Roses. Even if that's only partially true, it suggests Wallis was looking for emotional and physical satisfaction elsewhere. If she truly loved Edward, why would she need anyone else? Then there's Wallis's own behaviour during the abdication crisis. She tried to stop it. She offered to go back to Ernest. She begged Edward not to give up the throne. Those aren't the actions of a woman in love with a king. Those are the actions of a woman who knows she's about to become the most hated person in the world and desperately wants to avoid it. And after the abdication, friends reported that Wallis could be cruel to Edward. She'd mock him, belittle him, blame him for their exile. You don't treat someone you love that way. So if Wallis didn't love Edward, what was their relationship? I think it was a transaction that went horribly wrong. Wallis wanted security, status, jewels. Edward wanted someone to give him permission to escape his duty. They each thought they were using the other, but they both ended up trapped in a prison of their own making. And Edward? Did he love Wallis? Here's what I believe. Edward loved the idea of Wallis more than he loved the actual woman. He loved that she gave him a reason to abdicate. He loved that she represented freedom from duty. He loved having someone to obsess over, someone who would make decisions for him. But did he know Wallis? Did he understand her fears, her dreams, her real self? I don't think so. He saw a projection of his needs, not a complete human being. That's not love. That's dependence. That's obsession. That's using another person to escape your own life. And both of them paid the price. 35 years of exile. 35 years of bitterness and resentment. 35 years of being trapped together in a relationship neither could escape. Some people call it the greatest love story of the 20th century. I call it the greatest tragedy. Because real love doesn't destroy people. Real love doesn't lead to exile and regret. Real love doesn't leave you alone, confused, forgotten, dying in a house full of stolen jewellery and broken promises. Whatever Edward and Wallis had, it wasn't love. Not really. It was something darker, something more complicated, something that looked like love from the outside but felt like a cage from the inside. And now, finally, we come to the end of their story. 2 graves at Frogmore side by side. Edward, who gave up a throne, Wallis, who almost became queen, together forever, just as Edward always wanted. But are they at peace, or are they still trapped, even in death, in a relationship that never should have happened? In our final part, the last chapter of this extraordinary journey, we're going to step back and look at the bigger picture. What did the abdication really mean for the British monarchy? How did it shape the royal family we know today? What would have happened if Edward had stayed king? And what can we learn from this story about love, duty, sacrifice, and the lies we tell ourselves? Because this story isn't just about Edward and Wallis. It's about all of us, about the choices we make, about the prices we pay, about what happens when we confuse desire with love, escape with freedom, sacrifice with heroism. Stay with me for one more part. We're about to bring it all home. So here we are. We followed this story from a Baltimore boarding house to Buckingham Palace, from Chinese massage parlours to Nazi Germany, from a throne room to a grave at Frogmore. And now we need to ask, what does it all mean? What can we learn from 2 people who threw away everything for something they thought was love? Because this story, This extraordinary, tragic, controversial story, it's not really about Edward and Wallis. It's about all of us. About the choices we make when duty conflicts with desire. About what happens when we confuse escape with freedom. About the price we pay when we choose ourselves over everyone else. So let's talk about legacy. Let's talk about what ifs. And let's talk about whether, in the end, it was worth it. First, let's address the obvious question. What would have happened if Edward had stayed king? Historians have debated this for decades, and the consensus is, it would have been a disaster. Edward's Nazi sympathies were real. His political naivety was profound, and his complete disregard for duty was antithetical to everything the monarchy required. If Edward had remained king through World War II, with his German connections and his documented sympathy for Hitler, the damage to Britain's morale and international standing would have been catastrophic. Imagine this. It's 1940. Britain stands alone against Nazi Germany. The king, the symbolic head of the nation, has a history of praising Hitler. German intelligence has documents suggesting he'd be open to a peaceful compromise. How would that have affected British resolve? How would that have affected America's decision to enter the war? Churchill knew this. That's why he exiled Edward to the Bahamas, not just to punish him, but to remove a potential threat to national security. So in a twisted way, Edward's abdication might have saved Britain. By removing himself from power, he accidentally did the most patriotic thing of his life. The irony is delicious, isn't it? Edward thought he was choosing love over duty, but really he was saving his country from his own inadequacy. Now let's talk about what the abdication did to the monarchy itself. When Edward quit, he forced his brother Albert, King George VI, into a role Albert never wanted. Albert had a stammer, remember? He was terrified of public speaking. He was never prepared to be king. But something remarkable happened. Albert rose to the occasion. He and his wife, Queen Elizabeth, stayed in London during the Blitz. They visited bombed-out neighbourhoods. They shared the suffering of their people, and in doing so, they transformed the monarchy. Before Edward's abdication, the British monarchy was distant, formal, untouchable. After George VI's wartime service, it became something different. A monarchy that served rather than ruled. A monarchy that shared in national sacrifice. And when George VI died and his daughter Elizabeth became queen, she took that lesson to heart. Queen Elizabeth II would reign for 70 years, becoming the longest-serving monarch in British history. And she did it by being everything Edward wasn't. Dutiful, dedicated, selfless. In her 21st birthday speech in 1947, just 11 years after Edward's abdication, Princess Elizabeth said, "I declare before you all that my whole life, whether it be long or short, shall be devoted to your service." Every word of that speech was a rebuke to her uncle. Every year of her reign was proof that duty matters, that sacrifice matters, that being royal isn't about privilege, it's about service. Edward made the monarchy stronger by leaving it. That's his legacy. Not love, not romance, just absence. But what about Edward and Wallis as people? Can we find any sympathy for them? I think we can, and I think we should. Edward was a damaged man, raised by cold parents, thrust into a role he never wanted, given no tools to cope with the pressures of royalty. He was looking for an escape, and Wallis gave him one. Was it selfish? Absolutely. Was it understandable? Maybe. And Wallis? She was a survivor. She'd clawed her way up from nothing. She'd survived abuse, poverty, scandal. She'd learned to use the only tools society gave women in her era: beauty, wit, and the ability to attract powerful men. Was she manipulative? Probably. Was she just trying to survive in a world that gave women no other options? Also, probably. Neither of them was evil. They were just human. Flawed, selfish, short-sighted humans who made terrible choices and spent the rest of their lives paying for them. But here's what bothers me. They never admitted they were wrong. They never showed genuine remorse. Edward died believing he was a romantic hero. Wallis died before dementia took that belief from her. They never looked at the wreckage they'd caused, Edward's abandoned duty, his brother's premature death from stress, the constitutional crisis, the Nazi connections, and said, "We were wrong. We should have done better." Instead, they spent 35 years in exile, throwing parties and spending money and blaming everyone else for their misery. That's not tragic, that's just sad. So was it worth it? Did Edward sacrifice his throne for true love as he claimed? Here's my answer. No, it wasn't worth it. And it wasn't love. Real love doesn't require someone to give up everything. Real love doesn't lead to decades of resentment and regret. Real love doesn't end with one person mocking the other at dinner parties, while the other person drinks himself into oblivion. What Edward and Wallis had was codependency, obsession, two broken people using each other to avoid facing their real problems. Edward didn't give up the throne for Wallis. He gave it up to escape duty, and Wallis was his excuse. Wallis didn't want Edward. She wanted the security and status that came with him. And when that didn't materialize, she spent the rest of her life bitter about it. They were both using each other, and they both lost. But maybe, just maybe, there's something we can learn from their mistakes. First, duty matters. I know that sounds old-fashioned. I know we live in an age that celebrates following your heart and doing what makes you happy. But some responsibilities can't be abandoned without consequences. If you're a parent, a leader, someone people depend on, you don't get to just walk away because you're unhappy. Edward learned that the hard way. Second, love isn't enough. You need more than attraction and chemistry. You need shared values, compatible life goals, mutual respect. Edward and Wallis had none of those things. They had obsession, which burned hot and then left nothing but ashes. Third, be careful what you sacrifice, because once it's gone, you can't get it back. Edward gave up a throne, a purpose, a country. For what? For a woman who probably never loved him. For 35 years of exile. For a legacy of shame. Was it worth it? You tell me. And fourth, sometimes the person you're meant to be with isn't the person who makes your heart race. Sometimes it's the person who makes you better, who challenges you, who stands beside you through difficulty. Edward chose the woman who let him be his worst self, and that destroyed him. Let me tell you something interesting. In 2020, another royal couple made headlines by stepping back from royal duties. Prince Harry and Meghan Markle, and immediately people started comparing them to Edward and Wallis. American divorcee check, royal family disapproval check, exile from Britain check. The parallels are eerie, but here's the difference. Harry and Meghan didn't abandon duty to chase pleasure. They stepped back to protect their mental health and their children. They didn't cozy up to Nazis. They didn't spend decades in bitter exile blaming everyone else. They're building a life with purpose, advocacy work, charitable foundations, raising their kids away from toxic media attention. Whether you like them or not, they learned from Edward's mistakes. They're writing a different ending to a similar story. And that gives me hope. Hope that we can learn from history. Hope that we can make different choices. Hope that duty and happiness don't have to be mutually exclusive if you're willing to do the hard work of finding balance. Edward never found that balance. Wallis never found that balance, but maybe we can. So let me bring this story home. 2 graves at Frogmore, Edward and Wallis side by side for eternity, together just as Edward always wanted. But I wonder sometimes, if they could do it all over again, would they make the same choices? Would Edward still abdicate if he knew it would lead to 35 years of meaningless exile? Would Wallis still pursue the king if she knew she'd end up alone, forgotten? Her mind slowly dissolving, her jewellery stolen, her legacy a question mark? I don't think so. I think both of them would choose differently. But by the time they realised their mistake, it was too late. They were trapped in a story of their own making, unable to escape, and that's the real tragedy. Not that they chose love over duty, but that they chose wrong, and then spent the rest of their lives pretending they hadn't. The greatest love story of the 20th century? No. The greatest cautionary tale? Absolutely. Because Edward and Wallis teach us that you can have everything: wealth, beauty, fame, a king's devotion, and still end up with nothing. You can make the choice everyone calls brave and still be a coward. You can sacrifice everything for someone and still not have their heart. They teach us that running away from your problems doesn't solve them, that using another person as your escape route will trap you both. That love without respect, devotion without growth, sacrifice without purpose. These things don't build a life. They just build a very beautiful prison. And so we return to where we started. A Baltimore girl with nothing who almost became queen, and a prince who gave up everything to be with her. Did they love each other? Maybe, in their own broken way. Was it worth it? For the story it gave us, perhaps? For them? I don't think so. But they lived it. They owned it. They paid the price. And now, decades after they're gone, we're still talking about them. Still fascinated. Still trying to understand what drove them to make the choices they made. And maybe that's their real legacy. Not the love story they claim to live, but the warning they left behind. Choose wisely. Choose truly. And never ever confuse desire with love, or escape with freedom, or selfishness with sacrifice. Because in the end, you can't run from who you are. You can only become someone better or someone worse. Edward and Wallis chose worse, and they spent the rest of their lives living with that choice. May we all choose better. Thank you so much for staying with me through this entire journey. 2 hours together, exploring one of history's most complex, controversial, and misunderstood stories. I hope you found something valuable in it. Maybe a lesson, maybe a warning, maybe just a really good story to think about before you fall asleep. If this resonated with you, please hit that like button. Share this video with someone who loves history, or royal drama, or just complicated human stories. And drop a comment below. Do you think Edward and Wallis really loved each other? Do you think the abdication was brave or cowardly? I genuinely want to know what you think, and if you enjoyed this deep dive into history's most fascinating characters, stick around. Because we have so many more stories to explore together. Stories of love and loss, triumph and tragedy, choices and consequences. History is full of them, and I can't wait to share them with you. Until next time, sleep well, dream well, and remember, the choices you make today become the stories you tell tomorrow. Make them good ones. Good night.